Hey guys, tonight we're going deep into the sands of ancient Egypt, into a place where the air is dry, the silence is sacred, and the dead are very, very hungry. You wake up on a cool stone floor, and your first thought isn't about who you are or how you got here. It's about the smell. Warm, yeasty bread, roasted goose, fresh figs soaked in honey. The aroma curls through the air like incense, but heavier, more real. It's disorienting because as your eyes adjust to the flickering torchlight, you realise you're inside a tomb. There are hieroglyphs everywhere, etched, painted, even inlaid with lapis and gold. But what draws your eye isn't the glittering art. It's the table, a low stone slab piled with food, too fresh for a place sealed for centuries. Thick loaves of bread still steaming at the core. Jars of barley beer uncorked, frothy and weirdly aromatic. Slabs of dried meat carefully arranged next to preserved onions and something that looks suspiciously like salted catfish. This isn't a dream, this is a banquet, and you're the only living person here. That, or you're not as alive as you thought. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your city and time. I'm curious who's out there, especially if you're watching this at 3:00 am like a champ. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You hear faint chanting, not loud, more like a memory echoing off ancient limestone. Your fingers trace the edge of the offering slab, still slick with animal fat. You wonder if this feast is for you, and then you see the sarcophagus. It's not open, but you get the distinct impression that whatever's inside is aware of your presence. Watching, waiting. In ancient Egypt, death wasn't a full stop. It was a change of address. The dead needed food not just for symbolic comfort, but for literal survival. The ka, one part of the Egyptian soul, was the life force. When the body died, the ka stuck around, and like your stomach at midnight, it wanted snacks regularly. Predictably, luxuriously. So families delivered offerings to keep the ka happy. Not out of love necessarily, but because a cranky ka could turn into a petty ghost with an eternal grudge. You walk towards the wall and brush your hand over a scene painted in ochre, cobalt and deep green. It's a banquet. People sitting in rows, slaves pouring wine, priests holding platters. The dead person sits at the head, way too serene for someone who technically doesn't have a digestive tract. That's your first clue that the Egyptians believed death didn't mean missing out on dinner. But here's where it gets weird. That offering table back there. It might not just be ceremonial. The Egyptians believed the offerings could become metaphysically edible. Spells carved into the tomb, actual words shaped into stone, were recipes for transmutation. Speak the right spell, and that pile of bread could feed your soul. Speak the wrong one, and your ka might get nothing but cosmic breadcrumbs. There's a detail on the wall that catches your eye. A servant carrying what looks like an oversized lotus leaf, balanced on his back. On top of it, a cooked cow's leg. You squint. It's not just art, there's an inscription under it. You can't read it, but it pulses faintly, like it's still active. Like someone might have whispered it just moments ago. The fact Egyptians really did leave piles of food in tombs, not just as symbols, but as ongoing support for the soul. These weren't quick meals either. They were banquets fit for pharaohs, with courses and imported ingredients, garlic from Syria, honey from Nubia, wine stored in amphorae so large they needed 4 servants to carry. But here's the quirky angle. Sometimes the food was fake, like literally carved loaves of bread or painted jars of beer. Why? Scholars debate. Was it to save money? To ward off tomb robbers? Or did they believe the representation of food held the same power as the food itself? It's still up for debate, but one theory is that if the proper spells were inscribed nearby, even fake food could become magically edible in the afterlife. A kind of celestial DoorDash. And this opens a deeper question that scholars still argue over. Did Egyptians believe the spirit actually ate, like did the ka sit down at a ghost table and gnaw on ghost goose? Or was it more symbolic? Consumption through proximity or osmosis? Some texts say the food entered the nose of the deceased, which sounds terrible unless you're already dead, in which case I guess it's efficient. You step around a column and find another slab, this one empty. You get the feeling that someone, or something, is missing its meal. There's a dryness in the air, different from the desert dryness. More like thirst. A thirst older than dust. You instinctively reach for the jar of beer you passed earlier. It's still warm. You don't drink it, but you pour a little on the floor. Immediately the air shifts. It's not that anything changes physically, but it feels like the tomb exhales, like something tight in the ether just unclenched. You did something right, and something someone noticed. A faint breeze stirs your hair, though you're deep underground. You're starting to understand this isn't just a cultural quirk. Feeding the dead was part of a cosmic maintenance system, like charging your phone, except the phone is a soul that might haunt you if its battery hits zero. You turn slowly and look at the sarcophagus again. It's still shut, still silent. But now you notice the tiny lip print of gold leaf around the edges. A clue, maybe a promise, maybe a warning, and suddenly you're not hungry anymore. The smell of barley still lingers in the tomb's stagnant air, like a memory that refuses to fade. You step further into the chamber, and every footfall echoes louder than the last. Your shadow dances on walls painted with scenes of impossible abundance, piles of bread rising higher than the pyramids themselves, clusters of fruit so plump you swear they glisten under the dim torchlight. The room feels alive, like the feast is still happening, just beyond the veil of the visible. And that's when it hits you. This wasn't food left for mourning. It was food for continuation, for momentum, for the engine of the afterlife to keep running. The ancient Egyptians believed that death was just a detour, an awkward layover before the real journey began. And to make it through the bureaucracy of the underworld, you needed two things: divine favour and snacks. Bread and beer weren't just comfort food. They were the spiritual fuel that allowed the K to move through the next world. Think of it like charging up a ghost battery with carbs. You crouch next to an offering slab and trace the carving of a round loaf, perfectly etched. You can even see the scoring marks on top, like someone took a stylus and carefully recreated the last loaf they ever ate. Maybe they did. Actual loaves of bread have been found in tombs, scorched black but still whole after 3,000 years. Some were sweetened with dates or figs, others spiced with coriander. All of them handmade, likely by relatives or professional funerary bakers. And those weren't just tokens, they were contracts. Once you place bread beside the dead, you're making a deal. I remember you and I expect you to behave. You pick up a nearby cup, clay, simple but beautifully balanced in your hand. Dried residue clings to the bottom, and the faintest scent of fermented grain rises as you tilt it. Beer. Ancient Egyptians practically bathed in the stuff. It wasn't just a beverage, it was a staple food. Brewed thick like porridge, with floating chunks of mashed bread and wild yeast. The beer offered to the dead had its own variations. Stronger, sometimes flavoured, always abundant. You sip the air and imagine the car hovering nearby, guzzling down the spirit version. Fact. Bread and beer were the default combo in tomb offerings. Even the poorest graves tried to include a small loaf and a jar of beer, often wrapped in linen or tucked inside pottery. Archaeologists have unearthed hundreds of these little offerings, left like lunchboxes for the afterlife. And it wasn't just about having them there, it was about placing them with intention. Orientation mattered. The side of the body, the way the bread faced, the correct recitation of the offering spell. Otherwise, the meal might not activate. You pause by a mural where the deceased is shown with exaggerated eyes and a dreamy half smile. Rick reclining before a food-laden table. He looks satisfied. You don't realise it at first, but the table repeats itself over and over in the same scene. Bread, onions, goose, beer. Bread, onions, goose, beer. The artist wasn't lazy. That's how eternal meals were depicted, looping in visual form a cosmic conveyor belt of sustenance. And here's the fringe bit. Some tombs have no physical food at all. Instead, they rely entirely on painted or carved offerings. Like drawing a hamburger and trusting that your future ghost self will eat it. At first glance it seems cheap, but these illustrations were paired with HTP DG spells, offering formulas that invoke the king and gods to sanctify the image. The idea? If you paired a loaf painting with the right incantation, it could feed your care as well as a fresh-baked boule, but not everyone agrees this worked the same way. Scholars debate the potency of symbolic food. Was it a backup plan when resources were scarce? Or did the elite genuinely believe an image could deliver the same spiritual nutrition? The answer's murky, because tombs often contain both, actual offerings and carved depictions. Maybe it was about insurance. You can't trust the living to keep bringing goose legs every year. So why not chisel a few into the wall just in case? You move deeper into the tomb, into a chamber where the air feels even heavier. There's another offering table here, but this one is bare. No jars, no bread, only a carved groove down the centre, stained darker than the surrounding stone. You run your fingers along it. Burnt residue, maybe incense, maybe something else. You suddenly wonder if this is where the food was prepared, not just served. A little behind-the-scenes kitchen for ghost cuisine. There's a hum, barely there, low and droning. You think it's in your ears at first, but it pulses in the walls like a chant you can't quite make out. A memory of ritual, because these meals weren't just dropped off and forgotten. They were part of a whole process, summoning, blessing, feeding, dismissing. You don't just leave a ham sandwich and hope for the best. You perform, you recite, you make sure the dead know the food is for them and no one else. There's even a bizarre little historical record. In some funerary texts, the offering bread is described as hot, white and fine, which sounds less like a food description and more like a Tinder profile. But it gives us insight into their standards. Cold bread, not acceptable. Half-baked, an insult. Offerings weren't casual gestures. They were precise acts of worship tailored to the social standing and taste of the deceased. You step back from the table and notice a shallow basin nearby, crusted with dried silt. A basin like this might have been used for ritual hand-washing. Cleanliness was part of the offering process. Not for hygiene, but for cosmic alignment. You had to be pure to interact with the realm of the dead, even when handing over a goose leg. You imagine a priest in linen robes, head shaved, feet bare, holding a jar of beer and a platter of meat. He recites a spell, he lays the food down just right. He bows, and then he leaves. And somewhere in the unseen space between the worlds, the car leans forward and dines. And you're just beginning to get hungry yourself. But not for food, for understanding, for the reasons behind all this. Why so much attention, so much reverence was poured into feeding those who could no longer lift a fork. You turn toward the mural again, and for just a second, you swear the painted loaf looks a little fresher, like it knows you're looking at it. You follow the hallway deeper into the tomb, the stone under your feet cool and powdery with centuries of stillness. The torches throw long shadows ahead of you, each flicker revealing more of the painted world on the walls. This passage feels different, narrower, more intimate. The art changes too, less about feasting, more about figures. Human-shaped, yes, but not entirely human. You pause before a panel showing a man with arms outstretched, a glowing orb above his head, and a bird with a human face hovering behind him. That, your brain whispers, is the Bay. The Egyptians believed the soul had multiple parts, not one tidy ghost, but a whole committee of selfhood. The car was the life force, the vital essence that needed feeding. But the bar, that was something else. It was the personality, the individuality, the part that could leave the tomb at will. It had wings, for one, often depicted as a bird with the deceased's head, and it could fly between worlds, visit the living, commune with the gods, or just pop out for a midnight snack, which, let's be honest, sounds exactly like something you'd do if you were dead and bored. You keep walking, the air shifting again as you move past a stone threshold into a chamber shaped like a cross. Carvings line the walls, barbirds everywhere, perched on pillars, fluttering over offering tables, even diving beak first into open mouths. One bird holds a loaf of bread in its talons, another balances a jar of beer in its wings. The message is clear. The BR doesn't just observe the feast, it participates. There's a philosophical weirdness here. If the KA needs the food to survive, and the bear can leave and return, then which one is doing the eating? Or are they both sharing ghost leftovers in some spiritual refrigerator? Scholars have been debating this for decades. Some argue the K consumes the essence of the food while the Bay experiences the pleasure. Others think the distinctions weren't that rigid, more like overlapping functions. Whatever the truth, both parts required attention. You couldn't just feed one and ignore the other. That's like giving your stomach a steak and hoping your brain feels satisfied. You stop in front of a painting that makes your skin tingle. It's the same deceased figure as before, but now he's sitting between two statues of himself, one glowing, one shadowy. Above him floats the BA. Below him kneels a priest, hands raised in offering. There's text everywhere, a litany of food items, ingredients, incantations. This isn't just decoration. This is a technical manual for keeping a soul operational. Fact, The BA was believed to return to the body each night, nesting like a bird inside the corpse or the statue of the deceased. That's why tombs were constructed with such care. The bar needed a home base, a quiet, stable place to roost. Without it, the soul might get lost, or worse, restless. And a restless bar wasn't harmless. It could wander into the world of the living, stir up mischief, or possess someone in a particularly vengeful mood. So families fed the dead not only to honour them, but to keep them politely there. You brush your fingers across the painted wing of one of the bay figures. It's chipped, the pigment worn but still unmistakable. There's grace in the design, even a touch of humour. One bird looks like it's dancing, another stares into the distance with eyes that say, "Can we eat already?" You laugh under your breath and immediately feel like you've broken a rule. But nothing punishes you. Yet. And then comes the fringe detail. Some tombs included miniature statues or even amulets shaped like the bay. These weren't just representations. They were believed to house the bay, or at least attract it. Like putting out a hummingbird feeder for your soul. If the bar liked its little figurine, it might linger. If not, well, ancient texts are vague on what happened to bayless bodies, but none of it sounds good. You wander to the centre of the chamber, where a small altar sits beneath a faded star map. It's low and simple, with 2 bowls carved into the stone. You imagine filling one with milk, the other with fruit. Offerings for the bar's return at nightfall. You picture a shimmering bird form settling in quietly, ruffling feathers, satisfied. But the debate continues in your head. How literal was all this? Did ancient Egyptians believe these soul parts were actual tangible things, or metaphors for parts of the psyche? Some scholars say it's more poetic than practical, a culture deeply symbolic. Others argue the Egyptians weren't being metaphorical at all. They believed in these entities the same way you believe in gravity or taxes. The longer you stay in this tomb, the more convincing their system becomes. It's not chaotic. It's thorough, multi-layered, structured. There's comfort in it. Death isn't confusion here, it's logistics. Feed the KA. House the bar. Wrap the body tight. Lock the doors. Let eternity handle the rest. You glance back toward the hallway you came from. For a moment you imagine you see a baybird there, fluttering in and out of view like a glitch in old film. It's gone before you can blink. Or maybe it was never there, but you feel a shift. Like something's acknowledged you. Filed you under visitor, not intruder. And now you realise something strange. You're not alone in this chamber, though there is no one visible. The BA are watching. Maybe not maliciously, maybe just curious. They see you the way we might see a tourist poking around our childhood home. Confused, wide-eyed, a little out of place, but you're learning. You're beginning to grasp that to the ancient Egyptians, the soul wasn't a single flame. It was a constellation of lights, each needing its own ritual, its own care, its own meal, and ignoring one part could throw the whole system into disarray. You rest your hand on the altar and whisper a thank you. Not sure to whom, but it feels right. The air doesn't change, but your heartbeat does. Calmer, grounded, almost like your own bar just stretched its wings. The passage ahead narrows, so low and tight that you have to crouch as you move forward. One hand skimming the gritty ceiling for balance, the other brushing the cool stone beside you. You've moved beyond the painted halls and into a tunnel that feels far more private, almost like it was never meant for anyone alive to enter. The air is drier here, with that distinct tomb dust taste you're starting to recognise. Age, decay, a hint of burnt resin. And then you see it. A door. Not an actual functioning one, but a door-shaped carving in the wall, outlined in deep, precise grooves and painted to mimic the wooden grain of real panels. It's a door to nowhere, and yet somehow it's more imposing than any actual doorway you've ever stood in front of. This, you realise, is a false door, one of ancient Egypt's most haunting architectural features, not designed for the living, but for the dead, specifically for the Kea. The false door acted as a portal, a metaphysical opening through which the spirit could emerge to receive offerings. To you, it looks like a trick, a designed flourish maybe. But to the Egyptians, this was a serious cosmic interface. The boundary between the visible and invisible worlds, where a carefully staged meal could be delivered across planes of existence. You step back and examine the false door more closely. It's flanked by columns of hieroglyphs, each one spelling out not just names and titles, but specific food requests. The deceased is identified in glowing ochre as beloved of Osiris, overseer of the granaries, master of roast meats. You can't help but smile. This man didn't just want a tomb, he wanted a reputation, and probably a steady supply of roast goose with garlic. Above the door is the traditional offering formula, a spell that begins with a blessing from the king and ends in a detailed grocery list. Bread, beer, oxen, fowl, linen, and alabaster. The usual afterlife starter pack. And these words weren't casual inscriptions, they were instructions. Like telling a delivery service, please leave the hot goose at the back door, the Kia will pick it up at sunset. The false door isn't just symbolic, it was central to the practice of feeding the dead. Every offering made at the tomb, whether physical or magical, was presented to this spot. Priests stood in front of it, families knelt before it, dishes were placed directly on the floor beneath it, and the car was expected to emerge, though silently, invisibly, to receive them. You crouch again and notice something curious. A groove running along the base of the wall, stained darker than the rest of the stone. You run your fingers along it and feel a shallow depression worn smooth. This is where food and drink pooled, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by accident. Either way, it became part of the offering. The car, they believed, could draw sustenance from even the scent, the essence, the vapour of the offering left at the false door. Here's your historical fact of the night. Nearly every well-constructed tomb from the Old Kingdom onward included a false door. It was considered essential. No false door, no entry for the KA. The spiritual Wi-Fi was down and no amount of roasted duck would get through. Even in the smallest, poorest tombs, a painted or carved version was squeezed in, often near the head of the burial or aligned with the body's orientation. And here's the quirky twist. Sometimes these doors had tiny shelves or niches built into them, like spiritual pantries. Offerings could be stacked here. Real food, model veal bull food, or even just bowls of natron and water meant to purify the space. In some elite tombs, the false door was sculpted to resemble an actual entrance, with door bolts, hinges, and even a handle. A handle no one would ever turn. A door no one could ever walk through, except, of course, for the kakea. You reach out and place your palm against the carved panel. It's smooth, worn from centuries of ritual touch. For a moment it feels warmer than the rest of the stone. Not hot, not even warm really, but less cold, like it remembers hands, or maybe just the presence of need. You don't move, you don't breathe. Somewhere behind your thoughts there's a strange whisper of wings, but it passes. You wonder what it must have been like to be a priest performing the daily offering ritual, waking up before dawn, dressing in clean linen, reciting prayers as you place the food. You were feeding a person who could no longer thank you, could no longer eat in any earthly way, but you did it anyway, because someone had to, because forgetting meant risking spiritual starvation, and no one wanted to deal with a neglected spirit. That's the scholarly debate. How much of this was devotion, and how much was fear? Did they truly believe the KA depended on this food? Or was it insurance, emotional, social, even political? Feeding the dead kept the social fabric together. If you honoured your ancestors, your descendants might honour you. A generational chain of ghostly catering. You sit quietly beside the false door, the carved food lists above you like menus. You imagine the car stepping through, not like a ghost from horror movies, but something softer. A presence, a ripple, a moment. It doesn't need to shout or moan, it doesn't even need to appear, it just is. And it eats. You suddenly realise how much trust was built into these rituals. You had to believe the offerings worked, that they arrived, that the Kia could access them, enjoy them, benefit from them. There was no way to confirm, no Yelp reviews from the afterlife, just the sacred repetition of care. You stand and look once more at the false door, with its carved loaves, its spiralling ducks, its heavy jars of beer. It's beautiful, in a grim, comforting kind of way. Like a fireplace that's never been lit, but still smells faintly of ash and warmth. And then something almost funny strikes you. The Egyptians built more doors for the dead than for the living, and they kept those doors locked, not out of cruelty, but out of reverence, because for them, death wasn't a room you left, it was a room you had to keep furnished. You take one last look at the shadowed groove along the floor, where offerings once rested, where they may still linger in some metaphysical way. You whisper something dumb, bon appetit, because humour feels safer than silence. But as you turn to go, you're pretty sure the false door just breathed. You step away from the false door with a slow, deliberate kind of respect, like backing away from someone asleep or something sacred. There's a shift in the energy behind you now, the way you'd feel if you left a window open at night and realised the room had changed temperature. You don't look back. Not yet. Instead, you follow a narrow corridor that opens into another chamber. This one less decorated, more workmanlike. The walls are plain limestone, slightly curved inward at the top, and at the far end you see them, figures kneeling in rows, hands outstretched, some holding jars, others balancing trays of bread, meat, even entire geese. They aren't people, they're statues, maybe 2 feet tall, carved from wood, painted in now faded colours. Each one is slightly different, but all have the same blank, calm expression. They're facing the centre of the room where a large platform rises, worn smooth by time and presumably by ritual. This is where the mortuary priests worked, the living hands behind the meals for the dead, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of eternal catering staff. You step between the statues like you're intruding on a meeting, and the stillness is so complete it feels like you're walking underwater. These aren't just decorations, they were part of a system, a living economy dedicated to the dead. Mortuary priests weren't monks or shamans, they were functionaries. Hired men, sometimes from the family, but often professionals, tasked with one specific role: keep the offerings coming. Every day they brought food and recited the proper prayers. Every week they ensured the tomb was in order, the cave properly nourished. Every festival they prepared entire feasts. If you were rich, you could endow land or property in your will to fund a team of these priests for generations. If you were really rich, like pharaoh-level rich, the number of staff required was staggering. Dozens of priests, bakers, butchers and scribes, all working to keep your soul comfortable. The fact mortuary priests were a real respected profession in ancient Egypt. Their titles are recorded in tombs and temple inscriptions, and some even had their own family tombs. They weren't just ritualists, they were managers, responsible for supply chains, animal offerings, grain allocations. Feeding the dead was a serious logistical operation, especially when you were dealing with gods, kings and nobles who expected VIP treatment from the great beyond. But here's the fringe wrinkle. Not all of them were consistent. Some priests slacked off, some got lazy. There are records, grievances etched into tomb walls or scrawled in papyri, where descendants complain that the offerings aren't being delivered as promised. One man even accuses his brother of pocketing the funerary budget and using it to throw parties for the living. Nothing new under the sun, apparently. You circle the statues, noticing tiny details, a smear of red paint still visible on a duck's beak, a minuscule jar carved into a tray, the ghost of a hieroglyph, etched onto a servant's robe. These aren't just tokens, they're insurance policies. If the human priests failed or vanished, the statues were expected to take over. Magically. These were called servant figurines, and they weren't just for labour. They were supposed to cook, serve, and present offerings eternally. No breaks, no complaints, just silent, ghostly service forever. You kneel beside one and trace the base. There's a little crack running through its foot, and you get the oddest feeling that the thing's still ready, like it's waiting to clock in. You whisper, half joking, "You on break?" and immediately regret it. Not because anything moves, but because something inside the room settles deeper, as if something heard you. There's debate about whether these figurines actually worked. Were they meant to be activated by spells? Did the presence of real food trigger them? Some scholars argue they were purely symbolic, like a motivational poster in a break room. Others believe the Egyptians thought these little statues actually served in some metaphysical plane, that in the world behind the false door, they chopped onions and carried trays just like they were carved to do. Well, you step up onto the platform into the centre of the room and look down. It's stained in a wide arc, centuries of oil, incense, blood, maybe even wine. This was the performance space, the ritual stage. You picture a priest standing here, holding a goose by the wings, reciting a spell as he slits its throat. A baker kneading dough beside him. Another pouring beer into a basin while chanting the name of the dead. And here's the disturbing part. Some of these rituals weren't metaphorical. They involved actual sacrifices, real animals, real blood. The car needed sustenance, and symbolic food wasn't always enough. There's even evidence that in earlier periods, human servants were buried with their masters, until, thankfully, magical substitutes like these figurines became the norm. You crouch on the platform, the air thick and still. You imagine the routine. A priest arrives at dawn, places fresh bread at the base of the false door, lights incense, chants the offering formula. Maybe he pours beer onto the floor, maybe he doesn't. Maybe he's tired. Maybe he's done this for 30 years and still doesn't know if it works. But he does it anyway, because that's the deal. The dead depend on the living, and in return the living hope for blessings. Health, fortune, maybe even forgiveness. The tomb becomes a cycle. Food flows in, silence flows out, and if the car is pleased, that silence doesn't become something worse. You think about the weight of it, an entire civilization moving heaven and earth to keep the dead full and satisfied. Priests waking every day to feed people who haven't breathed in centuries. Farmers harvesting grain not for the market but for offerings. Bakers shaping loaves to be buried instead of eaten. It's oddly comforting. Not just the scale of it, but the commitment, the devotion. You look back at the statues, their faces serene, their trays forever balanced. You wonder if somehow they've been watching you this whole time, measuring your steps, noting your breath, preparing something, not for you, but maybe for someone waiting just beyond the false door. You step off the platform and bow slightly, not because you have to, but because it feels right. You've walked through kitchens for the dead, seen ghostly chefs frozen in time, and maybe, just maybe, you've interrupted a shift change. You ease your way out of the chamber of ghostly caterers, passing between rows of eternally kneeling figures, each one locked in silent devotion. The moment you leave the room, the stillness feels like it clings to your back like invisible dust settling over your shoulders. The corridor beyond curves slightly, the air shifting cooler as you descend into a new space. It's darker here, quieter, if that's even possible. But something's different. The walls are no longer blank or painted with simple scenes. They are speaking, not literally, but in the language of chisels and colour, in lines of hieroglyphs and long, intricate murals that almost vibrate with intensity. You've entered the part of the tomb that's not just about storing food. It's where the food becomes eternal. At first glance, it just looks like another wall painting. Stylized people in profile, long hands offering plates of food. But as your eyes adjust, the scale of the detail becomes overwhelming. There are hundreds of tiny offerings laid out in impossibly precise arrangements. Loaves of bread stacked 10 high, figs bunched in clusters of exactly 6, slabs of meat on bronze trays, pitchers pouring beer into bowls that never overflow. And behind it all, spells. Rows upon rows of spells carved so deeply and meticulously that your fingers twitch just looking at them. These are offering spells, known as HTP die senstept, an offering given by the king, though the king is mostly symbolic here. What matters are the words, the sounds, the rhythm. These weren't just decorations, they were mechanisms, engines to fuel eternity. You walk slowly, running your hand just above the wall's surface, careful not to touch but wanting to feel the pull of it. It's hypnotic. The food depicted here doesn't just look like food, it feels edible. You swear you can smell honey in the painted cakes, roasted onion in the hieroglyphs for stew. There's a magic to it, and not the cheesy fairy dust kind. This is the hardwired metaphysical kind, the kind with rules and power and consequences. Fact, these offering spells weren't improvised. They were standardized, recited the same way across tombs and temples for generations. Priests didn't wing it. They read from scrolls or recited from memory, repeating specific lines designed to activate the symbolic food. Think of it like a cosmic app, no prayer, no delivery, but say the formula just right, and the painted bread on the wall becomes something the car can consume, not in this world maybe, but in theirs. You pause in front of a particularly elaborate panel. It shows a full banquet laid out like a showroom. 3 types of beer, 4 kinds of meat, fruit, cakes, even water, which was sacred enough on its own, but there's something odd about it. One of the jars is painted with a zigzag line, meant to show sound. That's when it hits you. This isn't just a menu, it's an active ritual. The spell isn't describing food, it's calling it into being. Here's the quirky bit. Egyptians believed that writing had power, not metaphorical, actual power. To write something was to make it real. That's why scribes were so revered. They weren't just record keepers, they were engineers of reality. If a scribe painted a loaf of bread and paired it with the right spell, then that loaf existed in the afterlife. Not a copy, the real thing. Even broken or unfinished spells were thought to be dangerous. Imagine leaving a word half-carved, like pausing a prayer mid-sentence, and you might starve your car for eternity. Or worse, invite something else in. Some scholars argue about how literal the Egyptians were with this. Was it all symbolic? Was the belief just ritual poetry, metaphorically feeding the memory of a person? Others insist the Egyptians meant it word for word, that they truly thought these spells turned the symbolic into substance, not metaphorically, but through divine transformation. The jury's still out, but the tombs speak for themselves, and you're standing in a room where the walls are, quite literally, full of food. You kneel and lean in close to one of the lower panels. It shows a tiny roasted duck garnished with onions and slices of pomegranate. It's only a few inches wide, but rendered with obsessive accuracy. Next to it, a column of glyphs describes not just what it is, but how it was cooked. Crisped over flame, soaked in sweet beer, smoked for 2 hours. You can't help but chuckle. Even the K, apparently, had taste. Above the banquet scene is a row of seated figures, copies of the tomb's owner. You recognise his face from other murals. Calm, idealised, same false smile. Each version of him holds a piece of bread or a goblet. He's repeating himself over and over, dining eternally in painted perfection. This isn't just narcissism, it's magical reinforcement. If the car is called by these images and spells, then the soul will never forget who it was, what it liked, and where to return. But there's something else buried in the details. Among the banquet scenes, one wall shows a rare depiction, the absence of offerings. The car is seated alone, empty-handed, looking away from the table. The food is still there, but without the spell, without the ritual. It's a warning, a ghost story in mural form. Forget the spell, forget the offering, and the car goes hungry. Forever. You step back, shaken in a way you didn't expect. Not because it's scary, but because it's honest. These weren't vague rituals. They had instructions, consequences, like a spiritual checklist with eternal implications. You either kept up with it, or your soul went cold, and now you're wondering about all the tombs that didn't get maintained. All the car left to starve because no one remembered. All the walls where the spell broke or the priest never came. It's not sad exactly, but it is heavy. You turn one last time to the wall of food, the endless loop of offerings etched into stone. You whisper one of the names you see, just to see what happens. The air doesn't move, the duck doesn't reheat, but the room seems a little less empty. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the offering spells weren't about keeping ghosts fed. Maybe they were about keeping memory alive, keeping something of a person solid, tangible, visible, even in death. You exhale slowly, the scent of baked barley and spiced meat still ghosting the back of your tongue. The wall doesn't answer, but the silence feels full. You ease your way out of the chamber of ghostly caterers, passing between rows of eternally kneeling figures, each one locked in silent devotion. The moment you leave the room, the stillness feels like it clings to your back, like invisible dust settling over your shoulders. The corridor beyond curves slightly, the air shifting cooler as you descend into a new space, is darker here, quieter, if that's even possible. But something's different. The walls are no longer blank or painted with simple scenes. They are speaking, not literally, but in the language of chisels and colour, in lines of hieroglyphs and long, intricate murals that almost vibrate with intensity. You've entered the part of the tomb that's not just about storing food, it's where the food becomes eternal. At first glance, it just looks like another wall painting, stylized people in profile, long hands offering plates of food. But as your eyes adjust, the scale of the detail becomes overwhelming. There are hundreds of tiny offerings laid out in impossibly precise arrangements. Loaves of bread stacked 10 high, figs bunched in clusters of exactly 6, slabs of meat on bronze trays, pitchers pouring beer into bowls that never overflow. And behind it all, spells, rows upon rows of spells carved so deeply and meticulously that your fingers twitch just looking at them. These are offering spells, known as HTPDI, an offering given by the king, though the king is mostly symbolic here. What matters are the words, the sounds, the rhythm. These weren't just decorations, they were mechanisms, engines to fuel eternity. You walk slowly, running your hand just above the wall's surface, careful not to touch but wanting to feel the pull of it. It's hypnotic. The food depicted here doesn't just look like food, it feels edible. You swear you can smell honey in the painted cakes, roasted onion in the hieroglyphs for stew. There's a magic to it, and not the cheesy fairy dust kind. This is the hardwired metaphysical kind, the kind with rules and power and consequences. Fact, these offering spells weren't improvised, they were standardized, recited the same way across tombs and temples for generations. Priests didn't wing it. They read from scrolls or recited from memory, repeating specific lines designed to activate the symbolic food. Think of it like a cosmic app. No prayer, no delivery. But say the formula just right, and the painted bread on the wall becomes something the car can consume, not in this world maybe, but in theirs. You pause in front of a particularly elaborate panel. It shows a full banquet laid out like a showroom, 3 types of beer, 4 kinds of meat, fruit, cakes, even water, which was sacred enough on its own. But there's something odd about it. One of the jars is painted with a zigzag line, meant to show sound. That's when it hits you. This isn't just a menu, it's an active ritual. The spell isn't describing food, it's calling it into being. Here's the quirky bit. Egyptians believed that writing had power. Not metaphorical, actual power. To write something was to make it real. That's why scribes were so revered. They weren't just record keepers, they were engineers of reality. If a scribe painted a loaf of bread and paired it with the right spell, then that loaf existed in the afterlife. Not a copy. The real thing. Even broken or unfinished spells were thought to be dangerous. Imagine leaving a word half-carved, like pausing a prayer mid-sentence, and you might starve your car for eternity. Or worse, invite something else in. Some scholars argue about how literal the Egyptians were with this. Was it all symbolic? Was the belief just ritual poetry metaphorically feeding the memory of a person? Others insist the Egyptians meant it word for word, that they truly thought these spells turned the symbolic into substance, not metaphorically, but through divine transformation. The jury's still out, but the tombs speak for themselves, and you're standing in a room where the walls are, quite literally, full of food. You kneel and lean in close to one of the lower panels. It shows a tiny roasted duck, garnished with onions and slices of pomegranate. It's only a few inches wide, but rendered with obsessive accuracy. Next to it, a column of glyphs describes not just what it is, but how it was cooked. Crisped over flame, soaked in sweet beer, smoked for 2 hours. You can't help but chuckle. Even the K apparently had taste. Above the banquet scene is a row of seated figures, copies of the tomb's owner. You recognise his face from other murals. Calm, idealised, same false smile. Each version of him holds a piece of bread or a goblet. He's repeating himself over and over, dining eternally in painted perfection. This isn't just narcissism, it's magical reinforcement. If the car is called by these images and spells, then the soul will never forget who it was, what it liked, and where to return. But there's something else buried in the details. Among the banquet scenes, one wall shows a rare depiction. The absence of offerings. The car is seated alone, empty-handed, looking away from the table. The food is still there, but without the spell, without the ritual. It's a warning, a ghost story in mural form. Forget the spell, forget the offering, and the car goes hungry forever. You step back, shaken in a way you didn't expect. Not because it's scary, but because it's honest. These weren't vague rituals. They had instructions, consequences, like a spiritual checklist with eternal implications. You either kept up with it, or your soul went cold, and now you're wondering about all the tombs that didn't get maintained. All the car left to starve because no one remembered. All the walls where the spell broke, or the priest never came. It's not sad exactly, but it is heavy. You turn one last time to the wall of food, the endless loop of offerings etched into stone. You whisper one of the names you see, just to see what happens. The air doesn't move, the duck doesn't reheat, but the room seems a little less empty. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the offering spells weren't about keeping ghosts fed. Maybe they were about keeping memory alive, keeping something of a person solid, tangible, visible, even in death. You exhale slowly, the scent of baked barley and spiced meat still ghosting the back of your tongue. The wall doesn't answer, but the silence feels full. You leave the hall of wall feasts with your thoughts echoing louder than your footsteps. The air is thicker now, filled with that warm mineral scent of ancient stone. like rain on clay but filtered through time. There's a faint draft ahead, and you follow it, winding through a corridor so narrow your shoulders brush both sides at once. Then just when you start to feel boxed in, it opens into a small square chamber. And here, everything shifts again. The space is stark, almost austere. No statues, no colour, just clean-cut walls, covered top to bottom with hieroglyphs. You step closer and realise this is a list. No, not a list, a ledger. Lines and lines of carved symbols stacked like a grocery receipt the length of your arm. You recognise signs for bread, beer, geese, oxen, fruit, milk, incense. But they aren't just written once, they repeat in patterns, increasing and decreasing like some kind of celestial inventory. This isn't a decoration, it's a contract, an eternal order form for the needs of a soul. Welcome to the world of ancient Egyptian offering lists, a very specific, very certain subgenre of afterlife planning. Every noble tomb had one, tailored to the tastes and titles of the deceased. These lists didn't just say, bring food. They said what food, how much, how often, and for how long. The answer to that last one, in case you're wondering, is forever. You lean in and examine the columns. Each item has a number carved beside it. Some are modest, 2 loaves, 1 jar of beer. Others are unhinged. 100 oxen, 40 ducks, 1,000 cakes. You can almost hear the KR behind the false door saying this, "Hey, go big or die hungry." Here's the historical reality. These offering lists were standardized during certain periods of Egyptian history, especially in the Old Kingdom. Scribes followed templates, adjusting details for each tomb owner. The result? A kind of formulaic immortality. Once the list was written and blessed, it created a spiritual standing order with the universe. The food didn't even need to physically arrive every day. The list, combined with the proper ritual, was thought to manifest the essence of the meal on the other side. The Kerr just had to show up hungry. But, and here's the quirky twist, the lists weren't always logical. Some include absurd amounts of food, more than even a small army could consume. Others are wildly unbalanced. 20 jars of beer but only 2 loaves of bread or 7 geese and 0 fruit. It's as if the person commissioning the tomb had very specific cravings or a flair for the dramatic. If I'm gonna be dead, I'm gonna be drunk and surrounded by roast birds. You run your fingers along a row of numbers, noting the way they taper off toward the bottom of the wall. That's not accidental. Some offering lists were designed to gradually scale down the demands, like a ghost's appetite reducing over millennia. Others doubled down, growing more extravagant as the list progressed. Scholars argue about why. Was it a reflection of changing theology? Was the deceased worried about being forgotten, so they ramped up their demands to be harder to ignore? Or was it a final flex? I might be dead, but I'm still eating better than you. You spot a peculiar entry etched in its own little box, surrounded by stars and ankh symbols. It's not food, it's a request for perfume, specific oils, scented resins, the kind you'd anoint a body with during mummification. Apparently the car had a taste for fragrance too. And why not? If you're going to feast for eternity, might as well smell amazing while doing it. You glance up at a curious arrangement near the top of the wall. Instead of numbers, there are symbols stacked in a circle. Ducks, loaves, jars, all spiralling inward like a whirlpool. You squint. It looks less like a list and more like a vortex of hunger, or a visual prayer. It's unclear whether these artistic flourishes were meant to enhance the spell, or if some scribe just got bored and decided to make food art. Either way, you're pretty sure someone took it very seriously at the time. You sit against the back wall for a moment, letting the weight of it all settle. This room is nothing but math and desire, and yet it feels oddly human. You can picture someone dictating this list, pacing back and forth in fine linen, chewing on a date, thinking, 2 ducks? No, make it 6. And don't forget the coriander cake, I like coriander. Here's what no one agrees on. Did anyone actually expect these lists to be fulfilled by the living? Or were they always intended to be metaphysical backups? Some texts suggest the tomb's descendants were supposed to read the list aloud during festivals. Others imply that once the spells were in place, the key didn't need the physical food anymore. It's the great debate of Egyptian funerary theology, symbolic versus literal. Did they want the stuff or just the memory of the stuff? You stand and walk slowly around the room's perimeter, reading simply, line after line. After a while, the offerings blur into one another. Ox, bread, beer, oil, cake, duck, beer, beer, beer. It's like listening to a chant. You start to understand this isn't just a grocery list, it's a rhythm, a pulse, a heartbeat for the dead. Regular, dependable, nourishing. And as you make your final turn around the room, you see one last line etched in faded red pigment, almost erased by time. Let it not fail. Let the offerings be fresh. Let the name be spoken. That's it, isn't it? The food matters, yes, the spells absolutely. But beneath it all is the real nourishment. Memory. The name, spoken aloud, recalled, fed not just with bread but with breath. You whisper the name carved above that line just once, and for a second the air warms, only slightly, but you feel it, like the list just got acknowledged, like someone's K just crossed off the first item of the day. You step out of the offering list chamber with its careful math and sacred appetite still echoing in your mind, and immediately the energy shifts again. This new hallway is taller, grander. The walls widen, and the carvings start to stretch higher above your head, bolder, more dramatic. The air is cooler here, touched with something faintly sweet, like aged incense still clinging to the pores of the stone. A few steps in, you realise you're entering a different part of the story. Not about individual tombs or offerings carefully prepared for grandmothers or middle-ranking scribes. No, this is bigger. This is about the ruler of the dead himself, the king of eternity, the first mummy, the judge of souls, Osiris. The moment you round the corner into the grand hall, you see him. Osiris is seated on a throne carved into the wall in sharp relief, his skin painted the green of resurrection, a crook and flail across his chest. His eyes are outlined in black coal that's somehow still crisp despite thousands of years of dust. Around him gather gods and lesser spirits, animals, priests, dancers, but what dominates the scene and what you can't look away from is the table before him. It is overflowing. Loaves upon loaves, goblets upon goblets, mounds of meat, dried fish, onions, dates, cakes shaped like lotus blossoms. You have seen tomb offerings before, but nothing like this. This is the divine banquet. Osiris wasn't just the god of the afterlife, he was its ultimate host. According to Egyptian mythology, when you died, your soul didn't just lounge around. You had work to do, challenges to face, a heart to weigh. But if you passed those trials, if your heart balanced perfectly against the feather of Maat, then you joined Osiris in a blessed realm called the Field of Reeds. And in that field, between golden stalks of barley and water that ran backwards and forwards at once, was the banquet. You step closer to the mural and begin to see details you missed at first. A scribe near the edge of the table is writing down the names of the attendees. Next to him, a figure lifts a goblet toward Osiris, head bowed in reverence. Farther along, a group of baybirds perches delicately on branches, their human faces smiling. This isn't a feast you drop into by accident. You have to earn your seat here, and if you're lucky, you'll never leave. Fact. Texts like the Book of the Dead and the Coffin. Texts describe the Field of Reeds in rich detail. It wasn't just a paradise of soft grass and perpetual sunlight. It was a mirror of Egypt itself, only perfected. Everything you loved about life, food, family, labour, beauty, it was all there, polished and permanent. And central to that afterlife was food. You weren't floating on a cloud, you were farming, cooking, eating, resting. Repeat forever. It wasn't eternity as stagnation, it was eternity as the best version of life. Osiris made sure of it. Here's the strange part. Osiris himself was also fed. Lavishly, regularly. In temple rituals across Egypt, priests performed offerings not just for human dead, but for the god of death himself. In the temple of Abydos, Osiris received daily meals prepared with just as much care as those in tombs. Bread shaped in moulds carved with his name. Sacred beer brewed with herbs used nowhere else. Meat ritually slaughtered and presented on gold plates. The god of the afterlife didn't dine alone. And yet, there's a fringe fact here that doesn't often make it into textbooks. Some traditions describe Osiris's body as being eaten, ceremonially, during certain rituals. Not in a literal Hannibal Lecter kind of way, don't worry, but in a symbolic reenactment. Bits of bread or cake, shaped to represent parts of Osiris's divine form, were consumed during temple rites. Worshippers believed that by partaking in Osiris, they were ingesting eternity. Rebirth, the cycle of life and death and life again. Not all scholars agree on how widespread this practice was, but the echoes of it remain in ritual texts and temple art. a divine feast, both given and received. You stare at the painted face of Osiris and feel something profound lurking beneath the surface. This isn't just the god of the dead, he's the god of what comes next, and he's offering a seat at his table, if you've lived a life worthy of it. The debate among scholars, of course, is whether Egyptians took all of this literally. Did they truly expect to eat roasted duck in a golden field forever? Or was this an allegory? A visual metaphor for peace, fulfillment, immortality of the soul? Some argue it was both. The ancient Egyptians didn't draw a hard line between material and spiritual. They believed the physical world and the invisible world were mirror images, layered and interconnected. If food was necessary here, why wouldn't it be necessary there? You run your hand just above the banquet table on the wall, above a bowl of painted lentils so detailed you can see the texture. It's oddly moving, not just because of the beauty, but because it feels generous. The Egyptians didn't fear the afterlife as a void. They imagined it as a continuation of hospitality, of care, of gathering at a table and being remembered. Behind you, the chamber stretches farther than you thought. You hadn't noticed before, but along the base of the wall are dozens of smaller painted figures, less regal, less symmetrical. Common people, farmers, brewers, butchers, bakers, each one holding something, a tray of dates, a jug of beer, a basket of onions. They're all facing Osiris. They're all contributing. This is not just a god's meal. This is a community feast. The entire society, dead and divine, gathered to eat together in the afterlife. You suddenly feel a sense of belonging, even as an outsider. This whole belief system wasn't just about pharaohs or gods. It was about everyone. If you lived well, remembered your ancestors, made your offerings, and spoke the right names, you could be here too, under golden skies, among familiar faces, with a plate full of your favourite food and no need to ever say goodbye. You sit on the cool floor for a moment and take it all in. The green-skinned god, the impossibly abundant table, the mortals offering plates with trembling hands. It's not intimidating. It's peaceful. A vision of the end of life not as emptiness, but as invitation. And in that silence you wonder, what would your offering list look like? What meal would you request in eternity? And who would you hope sat across from you at the table? You smile, and it lingers long after you stand to leave. You leave Osiris behind reluctantly, stealing one last look at that divine banquet and its endless supply of goose legs and beer goblets. The imagery clings to you as you re-enter the winding tomb corridors, smaller again now, cozier, almost domestic. The stone feels warmer underfoot, or maybe it's just the lingering afterglow of imagining an afterlife with all-you-can-eat bread and no food poisoning. Still, the question hovers in your mind like incense smoke. What happens if the burial rites go wrong? What if your car is hungry and no one shows up? You round a corner into another chamber, less impressive, more intimate. The ceiling is low, the walls closer together, painted with simpler scenes. A man and woman sitting side by side, a servant handing them a jar, a dog under the table, a small child bringing a plate. This isn't royalty. This is a family tomb, and immediately something about it feels tense. The artwork is. Faded, scuffed. Some of the figures have been scratched out, faces erased, names gouged away. That's not vandalism, that's deliberate. You're looking at a burial gone wrong. This is the other side of Egyptian afterlife beliefs, the part they didn't glamorize in murals of Osiris and dancing bar birds. If you messed up your burial, or didn't get the proper rituals, or your descendants flaked on their priest payments, your K could go without sustenance, forever. And that wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Fact. Egyptians believed that the care required a functional body to return to. If the mummy was damaged or destroyed, or the name was erased from tomb walls, the soul couldn't find its home. That's why they obsessed over tomb security, inscriptions, backups, spells on spells. And if things still went wrong, if a tomb was robbed, a name desecrated, or offerings forgotten, the Kia might get desperate. You kneel beside a panel that shows an unfinished banquet scene. There's a table, yes, but no food on it. The family sits with hands poised in eternal expectation. The servant looks away mid-step. There's a subtle horror in the stillness of it. No spell here, no offering list, just hope hanging in the air like a starving breath. You're not imagining that dread. There are actual ancient letters, real documents, where the living plead with dead relatives not to haunt them. "I have brought you beer," one reads. "Why do you still torment me in my sleep?" Another, scrawled hastily on a pottery shard, asks a dead husband to stop appearing in his widow's dreams and making her ill. "I burned incense for you, I swear," she writes. "I gave you meat." Translation: why are you still hungry? The Egyptians had a term for these troubled dead, the mut, or sometimes the wandering bar. Souls denied their rituals or their offerings, stuck between worlds. These weren't evil spirits, they were desperate, forgotten, unfed. The Kea was built to receive. If no one provided, it might take matters into its own hands. And that brings us to the quirky but dark tradition of letters to the dead. These weren't just mournful messages or nostalgic diary entries. They were legally binding complaints. People wrote to their deceased relatives like they were customer service reps for the afterlife. "I gave you what you asked for, now stop giving my cow diarrhea." Real example, one letter accuses a dead uncle of causing his nephew's lawsuit to go poorly. Another begs a mother to let her son's love life improve. You examine the erase name on the wall again. Chisel marks, careful and violent. Someone wanted this person forgotten, and by removing the name, they essentially severed that soul's tether to the world. No name, no identity, no ritual access, which in Egyptian terms is worse than death. It's oblivion. But here's where things get complicated. Not every tomb was lavish. Not every family could afford a priestly endowment or a tomb stocked with bread. So what happened to the everyday Egyptians, the people without painted walls and stone slabs? Archaeologists have found modest burials with clay jars of barley, simple bundles of bread, hand-carved wooden offerings. Their spells weren't fancy. Sometimes it was just a few lines scratched on a coffin, or spoken by someone at the graveside. And still, they believed it mattered, that their love, their voice, their memory, could sustain the Kea. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how universal afterlife access really was. Some argue that elaborate tombs and daily offerings were only for the elite, and the poor had no real shot at eternal life. Others insist that the core beliefs were democratic, that everyone, regardless of status, could access the field of reeds if their family remembered them, if their name was spoken, if their body was preserved even just a little. You lean against the wall and feel the emotional weight of that idea. Being forgotten wasn't just sad, it was a death after death. It meant fading from history, from memory, from eternity. No Osiris, no banquet, no afterlife bakery, just silence. Still, not all was lost if the living failed. Some tombs included emergency spells, insurance policies. If no one came to deliver food, if the family line died out, certain inscriptions could conjure offerings on their own, like a ghostly meal plan set to auto-renew. These spells, etched into coffins or stelae, called directly to the gods, "If no sun comes to feed me, let this spell feed me instead." You pass into a smaller side chamber where the walls are cracked, but a few faded hieroglyphs remain. You make out a loaf, a jug, and a duck, each outlined in red. Just above them is a phrase you've seen before: "May they never fail." Not, "May they be delicious," not, "May they be plentiful," just, "May they never fail." Because failure meant the car would go hungry, and a hungry soul could become a dangerous one. You whisper that phrase under your breath. The words taste dry but whole. As you do, the light shifts slightly. Maybe just your torch flickering, or maybe something listening, accepting, not satisfied but acknowledged. You turn back toward the main corridor, leaving the empty banquet scene behind. It stays with you though, a reminder that in ancient Egypt feeding the dead wasn't just about generosity. It was about responsibility, about keeping promises, keeping peace. Because if you didn't, the Kea noticed. You move deeper into the tomb complex, following a soft draft and the faint shimmer of torchlight bouncing off polished limestone. The passage twists and narrows, but your steps are steady now, more confident. You've seen the opulence, the ritual, the offerings carved in stone. But as you emerge into the next chamber, that confidence falters a little. This place feels off, less sacred, more chaotic. The floor is littered with pottery shards, a few bones, a crumpled linen scrap yellowed to near transparency. You instinctively duck as you enter, though there's no real danger, only the aftershocks of a place that's been disturbed. This tomb has been robbed. The offering slab is still here, but it's cracked. You can see where someone pried it up with brute force, searching beneath for valuables. The walls have gashes in them, and deep as knife wounds. One painted figure is missing a face gouged out with a chisel. Offerings once painted around him are scratched beyond recognition. The energy here is different. Not just quiet, wrong. Like the car hasn't eaten in a very, very long time, and whatever remains is more hunger than soul. You kneel to study a pile of broken vessels near the slab. These weren't just storage jars. They were once filled with beer, oil, maybe preserved meats. The staining in the clay still carries faint traces of old rituals. You can almost smell it, sweet and sharp. It's clear that the tomb was once tended to, maybe even reverently. But that care ended suddenly. Violently. Now the place feels more like a crime scene than a sanctuary. Here's the cold historical fact. Tomb robbery in ancient Egypt wasn't rare. It was practically an industry. Despite all the curses and architectural tricks, most tombs were looted within a few generations of burial. Even priests were sometimes in on it. They knew where the goods were. They also knew which tombs had fallen out of favour, which families had no descendants left to defend their dead. And the temptation? Unbelievable. Gold, jewellery, rare oils, and yes, even the food. You think of it as treasure hunting, but these thieves weren't just after riches. In many cases, they stole the actual offerings. Meat wrapped in linen, still preserved. Jars of beer sealed with wax. Dried fruit carefully arranged beside statues. Looters weren't picky. Anything remotely valuable, economically or spiritually, was fair game. And when they were done with the valuables, some desecrated the body itself. Not just unwrapping mummies, but scattering bones, smashing sarcophagi, removing names from walls. Why the names? Because in Egyptian belief, erasing a name severed a person's connection to the world. Their identity unravelled, their K left disoriented, perhaps unable to access its offerings. In a weird, inverted way, looting wasn't just theft, it was spiritual assassination. You step around the broken slab and sit on a low stone bench, part of a once polished niche designed to hold figurines or offerings. It's been emptied long ago, but as you rest, you notice a strange detail. One part of the wall is untouched. A small corner, half hidden behind a tilted block, still holds a painted duck and a bowl of figs. The colours are vivid. The spell beside it is intact. You don't need to read hieroglyphs to feel its stubbornness. Someone, maybe the tomb owner, maybe a later visitor, carved this out of reach. A backup. A last-ditch hope for nourishment. There's something heartbreaking about it. Because while tomb robbery was profitable for the living, it was a cosmic disaster for the dead. A care without its body, its name, its offerings. What did it become? You picture that hollowed-out spirit, confused and starving, wandering the necropolis by moonlight, still hoping someone would bring a loaf of bread or whisper its name into the dark. And yet, there's resilience here too. That untouched spell, that hidden duck, it survived. It still hums with quiet magic. You feel a strange urge to read the food aloud, even if you butcher the pronunciation. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe the car doesn't care about vowels as long as the intention is right. You whisper, "Loaf, fig, duck." Your voice echoes slightly. Not loud, just enough to prove you're not alone. Here's the fringe fact. Archaeologists have found tombs that appear to have been refed after being looted. Centuries after the original burial, someone, maybe a distant descendant, maybe a sympathetic priest, restored the names, repainted spells, even left simple offerings. Bread in baskets, beer in clay cups, like spiritual paramedics showing up late trying to stabilise a patient who's been starving for centuries. You get the sense that someone tried that here. You spot a newer inscription, sloppier than the others. Just a single line etched into the lower corner of the wall. It reads, "I did not forget you." A tiny act of rebellion against the silence that looters tried to impose. The scholarly debate surrounding tomb looting always circles back to the same tension. Did the Egyptians really believe the Kaol could survive without its physical body and artifacts? Was the soul doomed or adaptable? Some argue that with the right spells, the Keb could still function, clinging to whatever fragments remained. Others believe that desecration was the end of the line, that once a tomb was violated, the spirit within it slowly unravelled into nothing. You look around this damaged chamber and see evidence of both. A broken place, yes, but not entirely destroyed, not forgotten. Something still lingers, not malicious, just waiting. You stand and brush dust from your knees. You know you should leave this space behind, but as you walk toward the exit, you pause beside that last untouched panel, the duck and fig. You don't bow, you just nod. A little acknowledgement. Hey, I see you. And for a breath of a moment, the air softens. Not forgiven, not healed, but maybe, just maybe remembered. You walk in silence now. The echo of your footsteps has changed. It's softer, flatter, like the tomb is absorbing the sound instead of bouncing it back. Maybe it's because the air is denser here, or maybe it's something else entirely. You're moving through a corridor that feels less like a place of rest and more like a long, slow exhale. The walls here are undecorated. Just smooth stone, no offerings, no images of geese or bakers or bee birds. You pass through a few empty niches and low thresholds until you come upon something strange. A narrow doorway leading into a chamber filled with shallow niches carved like mail slots. Each one holds a small rectangular piece of limestone or of pottery, propped up carefully like letters waiting to be read. And that's exactly what they are. You've just stepped into the complaints department of the afterlife. Ancient Egypt's customer service window for the dead. These are letters to the deceased, real ones, left by family members who had something to say, sometimes tender, sometimes pleading, and sometimes angry. You cross the room, slowly scanning the contents. Some are short, just a few lines. Others are long, nearly rambling, carved by shaky hands or scratched in haste. What they all have in common is a kind of desperate honesty. You've seen offerings, spells, banquets. Now you're looking at grievances, and wow, do they hold nothing back. You pick up one of the limestone shards and tilt it toward the light. The hieratic script, flowing and curved, runs unevenly across the surface. You can't read it directly, but you know the gist of it from historical records. A man is writing to his dead wife. He tells her he's honoured her properly, visited her tomb, brought her everything she ever wanted, beer, onions, incense, a goose on her birthday. And yet she's been haunting him, giving him nightmares, turning his dreams sour. "If I have failed you," he writes, "tell me what I have done. Do not cause my illness. Do not turn my house against me." You set the shard down slowly, like it might still be listening. The rawness of it cuts through the ceremonial layers you've been walking through this whole time. Because here's the thing. Despite all the spells, all the offerings, all the beautifully painted loaves of bread and golden geese, sometimes the dead got cranky. That's your fact tonight. Ancient Egyptians believed that the dead could, and often did, reach back into the world of the living, especially when something wasn't right. A forgotten ritual, a damaged tomb, a wrong inherited property dispute, or just emotional baggage that survived death. Letters like these have been found all over Egypt, usually left in or near the tomb of the deceased, meant to be read by the K directly. The fringe detail. Some of these letters are passive-aggressive in the most delightful way. One man accuses his dead brother of sabotaging his cattle and then adds, "I never touched your sandals." Another woman tells her late husband to stop whispering lies about her in other people's dreams. The drama doesn't die when the body does. It just moves to a more supernatural frequency. You sit on a stone ledge and scan the room, letting your eyes bounce across the clay and limestone shards. It's like an inbox frozen in time. Complaints, pleas, apologies, sometimes threats. A few even promise better offerings in exchange for peace. "I will bring you 2 ducks next festival if you stop giving my son a fever." You almost admire the negotiation tactics. There's one shard that stands out, different from the others. It's shaped like a tiny stela, smoothed more carefully, and the script is larger, deliberate. You lean in. This one isn't a complaint, it's a confession. A man writes to his deceased father that he couldn't afford the offerings last month. The harvest was bad, the bread was burnt, the beer turned sour. He says he feels ashamed, but he's coming back next month with fresh fruit and an apology loaf. "Do not turn your face from me," he writes. "I have not forgotten your name." The room suddenly feels warmer, less haunted, more human. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how literally the Egyptians took these letters. Were they venting? Performing rituals? Did they really think the KR was reading their messages? Or was it more about the act of writing, making their guilt or frustration tangible and placing it somewhere outside themselves? No one agrees, and maybe it doesn't matter, because whether or not the KA read these letters, the living sure needed to write them. You think about all the things you'd say to someone you've lost, all the unresolved scraps of conversation, all the unreturned words. The Egyptians just formalized it. They had a place, a protocol, a script. They made their grief functional, relational, and maybe, if they were lucky, reparable. You rise slowly and walk the perimeter of the chamber, passing more letters. Some are poetic, others are messy. Some are almost illegible, as if carved with shaking hands. You find one last note carved on a simple pottery fragment. The lines are slanted, rushed. You make out one phrase at the end, underlined twice. I still bring you bread. It doesn't say more than that. No request, no complaint, just that. As if to say, I remember. I haven't stopped. You leave the chamber feeling something heavy and bright all at once. In a world that built pyramids to feed the dead, maybe the most powerful offering wasn't a roast goose or a spell etched in gold leaf. Maybe it was just a sentence, a name, a promise scratched onto a pot shard. I still bring you bread. And you can't help but wonder who might still be bringing bread for you, long after you've stopped asking. The tomb feels quieter now, not in a lifeless way, but in the way an old cathedral does after the candles have burned low, reverent, worn, patient. You walk slowly, your torch casting a low amber light along the rough stone walls, flickering across faint etchings of bread loaves and hunched servants. You pass a half-collapsed archway and step into a chamber that smells oddly metallic, like rust and ash baked into the very bones of the room. This place is different from the others, darker, rawer, and then you see it. A wide, low platform stained a brown so deep it looks like it was soaked in it. Grooves carved into the stone run toward a drainage channel. You don't need to be a priest or archaeologist to figure out what happened here. This was a place of sacrifice. Feeding the dead wasn't always symbolic or sweetly spiritual. Sometimes it was very real and very bloody. You walk along the platform, the soles of your shoes crunching softly on ancient debris, shards of pottery, scorched bone fragments, maybe the last traces of some sacred cut of meat. Your torchlight catches the edge of a shallow basin nearby. It's blackened with what looks like the remains of oil, or fat, or something worse. Suddenly, those painted roast ducks on the tomb walls don't seem so quaint. They're not metaphors, they're recipes. Fact, offerings to the dead weren't always inert loaves and honeycakes. During key festivals, like the Feast of the Valley or the Wag Festival, animals were ritually slaughtered at tombs and temples as part of the offering process. Cattle, ducks, goats, geese. The blood wasn't hidden. It was essential. Ritual butchering wasn't just about giving meat to the Ka, it was about releasing energy. The act of taking life fed the realm of the dead in a way a painted loaf never could. You imagine the scene, priests in their linen robes wielding knives that glint in the early morning sun. Incantations whispered over a bound animal. The cry of the sacrifice echoing down the valley. Then the butchering begins. Orderly, precise, cuts placed on trays, blood drained into sacred basins, and always the spells, because if the words weren't right, the offering wouldn't activate. The food would be meat, but not nourishment. You crouch by the groove and run your fingers lightly along the edges. It's been worn smooth by centuries of repetition. This was not a one-time event. Sacrifices were regular, organised, and deeply tied to temple economies. In fact, some temples had entire departments dedicated to animal care, not out of kindness but to ensure a steady supply of high-quality offerings. Sacred cattle, temple geese, barley-fed ducks, the dead were demanding diners. And it wasn't just about food, it was about intimacy. To feed a Ka directly, the meat had to be offered fresh. Still warm, still releasing the energy of life. That's why some of these rituals happened right in front of the false door. The priest would slaughter the animal, call the Ka by name, and present the offering immediately. This wasn't grocery delivery. It was more like a personal chef carving a steak right at your table. The fringe detail? Sometimes the act of sacrifice was dramatized with elaborate performances, ritual plays where priests took on the roles of gods, reenacting cosmic events tied to life, death, and resurrection. In certain rites, the slaughter of the animal symbolized the defeat of chaos. The blood was not just sustenance, it was a magical substance, offered to maintain balance in the afterlife. The Ka wasn't just being fed, it was being fortified. Still, not everyone agrees on how literal this all was. Scholars debate whether the Egyptians believed the Ka consumed the food or simply drew power from it. Some suggest that the act of offering, rather than the food itself, was the true nourishment. Others argue that the physical remains, like bones and uneaten parts, were intentionally buried or burned to prevent spiritual contamination. In other words, food given to the dead stayed with the dead. You examine a stone slab to the side of the platform and find a curious carving, a cow clearly depicted mid-sacrifice, with a caption that translates loosely to "May her essence rise with the smoke." It's oddly poetic for such a brutal image, but that's Egypt. Nothing was one-dimensional. Death wasn't just an ending, it was a performance, a balancing act. And every meal in the tomb was part of a larger drama between order and chaos. You stand slowly and move toward the far end of the room, where a series of niches hold old soot-stained vessels. One has a symbol etched onto it, an ankh beside a duck. Life and dinner. The Egyptians never separated the two. To live was to eat, to die was to keep eating, and sometimes to do that something else had to stop breathing. The chamber begins to feel tighter now. You feel it in your chest. Not fear exactly, but weight. The understanding that what you've been walking through isn't just a gallery of ancient customs. It's a machine, a system powered by belief and ritual and, yes, blood. The dead weren't passively adored, they were served, and the price of that service was very real. You reach for a nearby torch sconce, half buried in limestone. Its base is sticky with the residue of old oils. You imagine the last time this room was full of light. Priests moving in practiced silence, servants arranging platters, the air thick with incense and smoke, and you wonder if the car was watching. Not from afar, but right there, just beyond the flame, mouth open, invisible hands reaching. You exit the chamber slowly, walking back through the hallway with the smell of old fire still clinging to your clothes. You don't speak, and no one answers. The silence has changed again. It's deeper now. You've seen how much work went into feeding the dead. You've seen the stone-carved menus and painted bread pyramids. But here, you saw the kitchen, the cost, and you're not sure you'll ever look at roast duck quite the same again. The next chamber seems almost laughably quaint after what you've just seen. You step through the doorway and freeze, not because of anything sinister, but because the room is filled with the tiniest, most delicate artifacts you've encountered yet. It looks like someone set up a miniature city for the dead, complete with rows of tiny bakeries, breweries, slaughterhouses, granaries, even a few small wooden boats floating in a shallow depression carved into the floor. You blink, then you blink again. None of this is symbolic. It's logistical. This is ancient Egypt's version of a backup hard drive. Scaled down, stylized, and absolutely essential. Welcome to the world of funerary models. You step closer to a palm-sized bakery made of painted wood and mud brick, complete with kneeling figurines pressing dough and others sliding it into little open ovens. Their faces are roughly carved, their arms outstretched mid-motion. Some wear painted aprons. They aren't static, they're frozen mid-shift. And beside them, a brewery is jars tilted at slight angles, with more miniature figures stirring beer mash in open vats. The scene plays out like a diorama crafted by civilization obsessed with making sure the dead had absolutely no excuse to go hungry. Fact, these models weren't toys. They were magical substitutes placed in tombs to provide eternal labour for the Ka. If no one came to bring actual bread, these little bakers would do it. If no priest poured beer during a festival, the wooden brewers had it covered. Some tombs, especially from the Middle Kingdom, contained dozens of such models, creating an entire ghost workforce who never slept, never asked for raises, and never missed a ritual. You lean over a butcher shop model, marvelling at the detail. One tiny figure is captured mid-slice, his knife aimed at a tiny clay cow. Another holds a tray with an impossibly tiny leg of beef. It's disturbingly charming. Functional art with a streak of morbid whimsy. Even the animals are there. Little goats and ducks carved from ivory or clay, eyes wide and docile standing next to their destiny. Here's the quirky twist. These models didn't just depict food preparation. They showed every stage of the process. You'll find workers grinding grain, feeding animals, hauling baskets of fruit, even scribes taking notes. These weren't just food factories, they were administrative ecosystems. A tomb might include a team of brewers and a supervisor figure nearby, holding a papyrus scroll like he's about to conduct an eternal performance review. You half expect a tiny clay boss to yell, "We're behind on ghost beer again, Thutmose." Some scholars believe the Egyptians created these because they feared their descendants wouldn't keep up the offerings. Think of it like hiring temp workers for the soul just in case. But others argue that the inclusion of models was more about abundance. Insurance, yes, but also status. Look how many people will serve me in the afterlife, the tomb owner might as well be saying. Even if they're made of wood, they'll work just fine. You glance at the far wall where more elaborate models are housed in tiny niches. There's a rowboat, complete with oarsmen mid-row. A granary stacked with real grains, some of which have fossilised in place. One model even shows a kitchen garden with palm trees and 3 gardeners tending little furrowed rows. This isn't just food storage, it's food production in miniature. The tomb becomes a self-sustaining universe. You crouch beside one model that catches your attention. Unlike the others, this one is broken in half, with a single kneeling figure missing its head. The surrounding paint is charred, like it was caught in a fire. You wonder if it was damaged during this burial or vandalised later, and that raises a grim question. What happens if your ghost staff gets broken? That's been the subject of scholarly debate for decades. Did a damaged model mean the task couldn't be performed? Did a headless baker mean no bread? Or was the spell itself the real power source? Some tombs included inscriptions designed to activate these models, written like a command. This man will bake bread, this woman will pour beer. So perhaps the figure was just a vessel. Or maybe the Egyptians hedged their bets and packed multiples of each worker just in case. The longer you study these models, the more you see them as tools of control. The afterlife, after all, could be chaotic. Tombs got robbed, priests got lazy, but a ghost with a miniature brewery had options. These models guaranteed that the KA wouldn't suffer from someone else's forgetfulness. It was clever, and just a little bit anxious. A kind of spiritual micromanagement. You run your finger gently along a line of figurines carrying baskets of food. Each one no taller than your palm, but carved with care. You imagine the artisan who made them, probably hunched over a work table, fashioning dozens of little limbs and painted faces, knowing these weren't decorations. These were a soul's last hope for a good meal. Achaea's final lifeline. Eternal lunch prep in wood and clay. You rise and look around the room once more. If the grand banquet you saw earlier was the dream, this room is the infrastructure. The backup kitchen, the ghost pantry, and somehow it makes the whole belief system feel more practical than mystical. They didn't just hope the dead would be fed, they planned for it, model by tiny model. Before leaving, you reach out and straighten a slightly tilted figurine near the bakery. The little man is holding a tray of round loaves, his eyes slightly too wide. You wonder if he's been baking for thousands of years without a break. You whisper, "Thanks for your service," and gently step back. And maybe, just maybe, someone's Kie smiles. You move on through the narrowing passageways, ducking beneath a lintel crusted with ancient soot, when a new chamber opens up before you. It's quieter here, more still somehow, but the walls are alive. Not with paintings or hieroglyphs this time, but with something subtler, stranger. Rows of carved faces, eyes wide, mouths slightly open, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, etched into the walls, each looking straight ahead, some serene, others grim, all silent. This is a chapel of mouths, or rather, the absence of mouths. And suddenly you understand, you're standing in a room devoted to one question that probably haunted every Egyptian at some point. How do you eat without a mouth? You walk slowly along the chamber's edge, the torchlight catching the faint outline of inscriptions and incantations. You've seen offerings, banquets, carved ducks and bakers made of wood. But this room gets to the weird heart of the afterlife's logistics. Because the Egyptians weren't naive. They embalmed their dead, removed their organs, sewed their mouths shut. They saw that decay took everything. And yet, they insisted the dead could eat. Fact. The ancient Egyptians believed that after death, the body's senses had to be restored through ritual. That meant touching, breathing, walking, and yes, eating. One of the most crucial spells in all funerary practice was called the opening of the mouth ceremony. It was performed on the deceased mummy or statue by a priest using special ritual tools, curved blades, incense, symbolic implements, to symbolically reopen the senses. Only then could the Kea consume offerings. No ceremony, no spiritual digestion, no feast, just a ghost staring blankly at a duck leg forever. You imagine the priest dressed in leopard skin chanting while touching the lips of the mummy with a small forked blade made of stone or copper. He's not just going through the motions, he's reanimating function, unlocking hunger, reconnecting the dead to the world they just left behind. Even the statues of the dead had their mouths opened with this ritual, because even an image of a person needed access to speech and sustenance. You pause before one of the wall-carved faces, its mouth slightly open, its eyes fixed on you. The expression is calm, but the details are unsettling. Lips exaggerated, cheeks etched with grooves as if hollowed by hunger. The line of a jaw too thin. The message is clear. Without the ritual, the Ka is aware of food but unable to take it in, and that, in Egyptian cosmology, is a terrifying fate. Here's the fringe fact. Some variations of the opening of the mouth ceremony included the slaughter of an animal, often a calf, whose front leg was waved over the mummy's face. The animal's life force was believed to awaken the senses of the deceased. The priests didn't just chant, they acted out reanimation, breath by breath, mouth to mouth. It was theatre with cosmic stakes. You move farther into the chamber and notice a series of painted scenes just above eye level. In one, a mummy lies flat while a priest hovers beside it, with a strangely shaped tool, a kind of ceremonial chisel with two prongs. Behind the priest stands a scribe holding a scroll. Another figure holds a bowl of natron. It's a ritual assembly line. Restore, purify, offer, repeat. And yet there's a scholarly debate lingering beneath all this precision. Did the Egyptians believe the dead actually chewed and swallowed? Or was eating something metaphorical, consuming through essence, through proximity? Some texts hint that the Ka could draw energy from smell or from the ritual itself. Others imply full participation, that a successful mouth opening meant the dead could taste the beer and chew the meat, as one particularly enthusiastic inscription puts it. You bend down to examine a small stone statue in a niche, no more than a foot tall. The face is worn but still recognisable. Its mouth is wide open, and inside is a line of dark red pigment, faded but clearly intentional. You're looking at a visual metaphor, or maybe a magical one. This isn't a statue anymore, it's a being, mid-meal. Someone went to great effort to ensure that whoever this was, they'd never miss another dinner. The papyrus scroll replica sits curled beside the statue under a protective casing. It contains fragments of a hymn that includes one of the most haunting lines you've come across yet. My mouth is opened, my throat is cleared, my stomach is prepared for eternity. You can almost hear it being recited, slow, rhythmic, devotional. It doesn't just invoke appetite, it evokes resurrection. You sit on a low bench along the edge of the chamber, thinking of all the technical effort that went into such a deeply human need. They didn't carve these tombs because they loved drama. They did it because they knew in their bones, that survival wasn't guaranteed, not even in death. You had to work for it, or more precisely, someone had to work on you for it. The mouth wasn't just an opening for food, it was a threshold, a ritual gateway. And you start to see this room differently, not as a place of stillehnos, but of activation. You imagine each figure on the wall having its mouth opened one by one, not with blades, but with words, with names spoken by family, with loaves placed gently on the offering slab, with beer poured in their honour. Each ceremony another switch flipped, another Ka awakened. Before you leave, you whisper something, not a name, just a greeting. Maybe it's dumb, maybe it's exactly what they've been waiting for. Either way, the room doesn't answer. But the mouths seem a little less closed now. You make your way out of the chamber of opened mouths, your own jaw a little tight now, as if all that silent hunger has left a residue in your bones. The air feels warmer again, and the passage begins to widen. You follow a ramp that curves gently downward and enter a new room, this one brightly painted, almost festive compared to the solemn hush of the last. Immediately you know you've stepped into something different. This isn't a place of pleading or preparation. This is a place of indulgence. The walls are covered with painted scenes so extravagant they verge on absurd. A line of servants carries trays stacked with roast ducks, ribs of beef, platters of honey-glazed cakes. Wine jars are being opened, foaming with red liquid. A man sits cross-legged before a low table heaped with food, smiling faintly, like he's 2 bites away from a nap. And beside him, a towering pile of geese, not 2 or 3, but at least a dozen. Stacked artfully, each one painted with care, their feathers glossy and necks folded politely. If ancient Egypt had a Michelin rating system, this tomb would be full of stars. You walk the perimeter slowly, absorbing it all. This isn't the austere precision of spells and model bakers. This is opulence. And there's a very specific message radiating from every wall. The dead did not do diets. Fact, The ancient Egyptian ideal for afterlife meals wasn't moderation, it was maximum abundance. The Kir wasn't supposed to nibble on lentils in eternity. It wanted fatty cuts of meat, spiced stews, baskets of figs, handfuls of dates soaked in wine. Especially for the wealthy and noble, a proper afterlife meant feasting. And not just on holy days. Daily, repeatedly, forever. You look at a mural where the deceased is shown eating the same roast duck 4 different times. It's not a mistake. That's eternity, baby. The quirky part? Some tombs contain menus so wildly caloric that perhaps if you tried to follow them in real life, you'd be downing somewhere around 6,000 to 8,000 calories a day. Before the beer. You get the sense that in the afterlife restraint was for the living. The Kir deserved everything. And if one roast goose was good, 10 were divine. You pause in front of a beautifully painted panel showing a large cake surrounded by jars labelled honey and lotus syrup. The cake itself has 6 layers, decorated with alternating stripes of what must be date paste and sesame. You swear you can almost smell it, sweet and rich, thick with indulgence. It's enough to make you hungry even now, surrounded by dust and silence. Then you notice something else. The seated figure beside the cake is young, not the age elder shown in most tomb scenes, but vibrant, idealised. And this is no accident. Egyptians didn't want to age in the afterlife. They wanted to exist forever at their peak, physically, spiritually, and apparently metabolically. The ideal afterlife was full of food, but your Kir never gained weight. You never slowed down, you never felt too full, just eternal appetite, eternally satisfied. There's scholarly debate about whether this was metaphor or fantasy. Did they really believe they'd dine forever in the field of reeds without consequences? Some argue yes, absolutely. Others suggest the food was symbolic, that consuming it represented continuity, not pleasure. But these painted walls aren't ambiguous. They celebrate the act of feasting. Faces are joyful, meat is plentiful, tables are always full. The artist didn't leave room for restraint. And it wasn't just men doing the feasting. You notice a panel where a woman reclines on a couch, plucking dates from a golden bowl, while servants pour her wine. She's dressed in a sheer linen gown, her black wig adorned with lotus blossoms. Her expression is content, elegant, indulgent. The food before her is carefully labelled. Figs from Nubia, wine from the Delta, honey cakes baked in the house of eternity. The message is clear. The afterlife wasn't just reserved for pharaohs. Anyone who could afford a proper burial could feast like royalty. You move toward a low shelf carved into the wall where several small offering vessels remain, mostly broken, some intact. One still smells faintly of myrrh. Another, when tilted, rattles with what sounds like dried seeds or maybe old spice fragments. Someone once filled these, likely during a ritual feast day. You picture them walking in, placing the jars carefully, reciting the name of the deceased, then backing away quietly as if leaving a tray of food outside a locked door. One inscription nearby is short but telling. For my father, the great scribe, may his belly be full. It's affectionate and practical like any good food wish, but you sense something else too. Pride. This wasn't just nourishment, it was honour. A full tomb was proof of a life well lived and remembered. You sit briefly on the stone bench beneath the painted geese, feeling how different this space is from the sombre silence of the sacrificial chamber. Here, everything is warm, not in temperature, but in tone. This is a room of comfort, celebration, love, even. The idea that the best way to remember someone was not with tears, but with a feast in their honour, and the hope that they were feasting too, somewhere beyond reach. There's one last image on the far wall that draws your eye. It shows the tomb owner seated with 3 generations of family behind him. Children, grandchildren, all holding trays of food. Not grieving, not bowing, smiling. You imagine the story, a family that remembered, a family that kept coming back, who brought roast duck and honey bread every year, and whispered the same words each time. Eat well, be well, we remember you. You rise and take one last slow lap around the room, then pause at the mural of the young woman with the wine bowl. She hasn't moved, obviously, but something about her seems even more vivid now, like the light hit her differently. Or maybe you're just noticing what she's been trying to say this whole time. If you're going to feed the dead, don't skimp. As you leave the feast-filled chamber, ducking beneath the low archway once more, you feel a shift. Not in temperature or sound, but in intention. The last room was joyfully physical, gluttonous in the best way. But now the air is quieter again, charged with something you can't quite name. You're moving into a new kind of space, a chamber of ideas more than objects. And when you enter, it feels like you've stepped not into a tomb, but into the engine room of Egyptian belief. The walls here are strange, spare, but purposeful. Not covered in banquet scenes or livestock counts. Instead, they pulse with the rows of text. Spells, prayers, invocations. Between the columns are single painted items, a loaf of bread, a jug of beer, a roast duck, each one floating alone in blank space, no context, no servant hands delivering them, no plates, just appearing, like a magician's conjuring trick paused mid-spell. Welcome to the world of offering magic. You've seen the physical offerings, real food, carved food, miniature bakers, all feeding the car with varying degrees of enthusiasm. But this room? This is where things get metaphysical, where the Egyptians stopped relying on bread and geese and began to lean into something far more efficient, spells that make food exist, words that don't describe but create, not symbols, not metaphors, function. Fact, by the Middle Kingdom, funerary texts began including offering spells, so detailed, so specific, they read like incantations from a magical cookbook. These weren't requests, they were commands. Speak them and the duck appears. Speak them and the beer froths. Speak them and the car receives what it needs, instantly, invisibly, eternally. No priests, no servants, no model bakeries, just language made sacred. You stand before a large slab covered in vertical columns of hieroglyphs. They flow downward like lines of ancient code. One column begins with an image of a loaf followed by symbols for hot, white and fine. Another spells out beer, cool in its jar, strong in its scent. It's almost sensual. The spell doesn't just name the food, it activates it. It tells the universe, make this real. The fringe detail. Some of these spells were designed to auto-renew. One particular formula, popular in the Book of the Dead, includes a line that translates loosely as, "May this be repeated each day in every season without fail." A spiritual subscription service, if you will. Eternal food deliveries, auto-shipped to your KA, whether or not your family remembered to show up. But you have to wonder, was this plan B? Did they start leaning into magical offerings when physical ones failed? Scholars debate it. Some say these spells were always part of the process, running parallel to real-world offerings, like an invisible backup plan. Others believe they gained popularity because families stopped visiting tombs regularly, and the priests got tired of managing all those ducks. Either way, the result was the same. A system that didn't rely on memory or loyalty, but on divine code. As long as the words were intact, the feast would continue. You walk farther along the wall and find another scene, this one more abstract. A seated figure with no features, surrounded by floating food. Bread above the head, beer near the knees, a goose hovering near the heart. There's something trippy about it, like an early attempt at visualizing data. You stare for a moment and start to feel the rhythm in it. The food is aligned with parts of the body, the soul. It's not just nourishment, it's attunement. Harmony between the physical, the spiritual and the magical. You crouch near the base of the wall, where a smaller set of spells is carved with finer lines. These are the contingency plans. Spells that kick in if the mouth fails to open, or if no sun comes bearing bread. They read like technical support. If all else is forgotten, let this be remembered. It's a haunting thought, the idea that the dead knew they'd eventually be neglected, and built magical escape hatches into their tombs just in case. And yet there's hope in that too. You imagine the care awakening centuries later. No family in sight, no priests, the tomb looted. But the spell? Still there. The bread? Still conjured. The beer? Still cool in its jar, because the spell said so. It's both chilling and oddly beautiful. A belief system that allowed the dead to provide for themselves, even after all human contact had ceased. You find a carved bench and sit, watching the flickering torchlight play across the floating food glyphs. You wonder how it would feel, as a soul, to be hungry and then suddenly not, to feel the weight of starvation lift because a stranger whispered the right words, or because the spell you had carved in limestone 3 millennia ago still worked. And that leads to the next debate. Did the Egyptians really think the food materialized? Like, poof, goose appears? Or was it more about energy, essence, taste, memory? The scholars argue, but maybe they're missing the point. Maybe the food wasn't the object. Maybe it was the act of feeding, the motion, the attention, the care embedded in language. The same way we say grace before a meal or read recipes from memory. Not because we expect a miracle, but because it connects us to something bigger than the bite itself. You reach out and trace one of the carved spells with your finger, not touching it, just near enough to feel the groove in the air. You try to sound it out softly, not that you know the language, but the rhythm carries anyway. A kind of hum builds behind your ribs. It's not spooky, it's not theatrical, it's just present. You whisper, let it be hot, let it be fresh, let it be forever. And for a moment it is. You step out of the chamber of spells feeling different, lighter, like something invisible had offered you a sip of something sacred, or maybe just wiped a smudge off your thoughts. The tomb's corridors twist again, this time opening into a room not grand, not gloomy, but oddly familiar. You stop at the threshold, blinking, because it looks, almost, like a market stall, or a storefront. Rows of small shelves carved into the stone, neat and organised, once filled with vessels, scrolls, maybe the occasional trussed duck or glazed cake. The walls are inscribed with names, not of gods or pharaohs, but people. Real people, business people, all. This is where you meet the suppliers, the tomb economy. It hits you all at once. Feeding the dead wasn't just a family matter or a priestly duty. It was a full-blown industry with budgets, contracts, payroll. People lived entire lives, bought homes, raised children based on their role in the afterlife economy. They weren't spiritual guides. They were administrators, funeral planners, accountants of eternity. Fact, by the Middle Kingdom, the business of keeping a tomb stocked had become formalised. Wealthy Egyptians could establish endowments, legal contracts that assigned farmland, animals, or other revenue sources to fund offerings for generations. These endowments hired priests, bakers, brewers, tribes and other workers to maintain the daily or festival rituals, and crucially they were enforced with paperwork. Tombs weren't just burial sites, they were financial portfolios. You walk between the stone shelves, some still labelled with names in faded pigment. Kiti, overseer of goose pens. Merit, keeper of bread moulds. Pakenti, steward of offering accounts. You half expect to see a dusty register with numbers scrawled next to loaves and jars. These weren't ceremonial titles, they were jobs. People worked, and sometimes argued, over how much barley went to the dead versus how much got sold at market. And here's the weird, wonderful fringe fact. The records survive. On papyri and ostraca, you'll find complaints about missing offerings, budget overruns, lazy priests, and mismanaged supplies. One particularly sassy note from a temple manager complains that a baker slept past the morning rite and offered stale bread, as he often does. Another scribe logs a shortage of incense and concludes it must have been misplaced by the gods or hoarded by the temple cat. It's petty, it's bureaucratic, it's amazing. You sit on a bench near the centre of the chamber, picturing the daily grind. A priest hurrying down the avenue of tombs with a jug of beer under one arm and a sheaf of papyrus under the other, muttering about inventory. A baker kneading dough at dawn, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one shorted him on sesame. A manager double-checking the name on a goose's tag before the offering. It's easy to think of the afterlife as this glittering, unreachable realm, but for the people keeping it running, it was just work. That's the thing people forget. Someone got paid to keep your KA fed. Even the divine realm ran on hustle. Some tomb owners tried to take matters into their own hands by micromanaging from the grave. You walk over to a stela built into the wall, its inscription half eroded but still legible in places. It's a list of instructions from a deceased nobleman to his offering staff. He tells them which beer to use, not the cloudy one, how to present the goose, with head turned left, and even includes a recipe for bread he prefers, something about sweet coriander and a baking time not exceeding 3 hearths. You can practically hear his car shouting through the limestone, "Don't mess it up just because I'm dead." The scholarly debate kicks in again here. Some argue that these contracts were legally binding, that tomb staff were held accountable in this life and maybe the next. Others believe it was mostly symbolic, a kind of wishful thinking dressed up in legalese. But given the number of offering endowments and the bureaucracy that surrounded them, it seems clear that many families expected their rituals to be maintained and sued when they weren't. Lawsuits about ghost food, ancient Egypt everyone. You spot a name carved above one shelf, Neferhotep, son of Jed Khonsu. No title, just a name. but beside it is a faint carving of an open hand holding a scroll. Maybe a clerk, maybe a scribe who handled the accounts. You run your fingers above the etching, not quite touching. You wonder if he was proud of his job, if he liked balancing barley quotas and scheduling priest shifts. Or maybe he dreamed of something quieter, being a baker perhaps, or tending goats. But the afterlife had deadlines. You circle back to the centre of the room and take a moment to consider the full machine. The food you've seen, the bread, the ducks, the jars of beer. None of it just appeared. It was grown, raised, prepared, recorded, delivered. Every step was labour. Every offering was the final link in a chain that stretched across lives and lifetimes. Feeding the dead wasn't just ritual. It was economy. Infrastructure. It had to be. When eternity is on the line, you don't leave things to chance. And this raises the final sobering thought. What happened when the money ran out? You glance at a faded inscription along the wall. It's not a spell, just a note. Almost casual. It reads, "The fields were sold, the offering stopped, the name remains." And that's where it ends. You close your eyes for a moment, letting that last line settle. Because it feels like the heart of the whole enterprise. They built pyramids, carved spells, wrote contracts, slaughtered ducks, and through it all, one thing mattered more than anything: the name, spoken, carved, remembered. Because in the end, the best way to feed the dead might not have been with food or beer or elaborate rituals. It might have been with that. You linger in the tomb economy chamber for a while longer, letting the echoes of names and numbers settle into the dust. But then, as the torchlight begins to gutter, you move on. You don't know how long you've been down here, how many turns you've taken, but the walls are shifting again. Narrower, rougher, less paint, fewer spells. The language of eternity starts to thin out. You feel it before you understand it. You've entered a place where time forgot to follow up. This is where the offerings stopped. The chamber is plain. The walls are blank except for a single faint line of hieroglyphs above the doorway. May this sustain me until memory ends. It's optimistic in tone, tragic in hindsight. Because this tomb, unlike the others, feels abandoned. Not destroyed, not looted, just forgotten. The offering table is still here, but it's covered in a soft layer of sediment. The kind that settles only when no one's touched a surface in hundreds, maybe thousands of years. You step toward it, careful not to disturb the patterns in the dust. There are 3 offering jars, ceramic still upright, one with a thin crack down the side. Beside them, a dried husk of something once organic, bread maybe, or fruit. The offering spell is barely visible now, worn down by time, erosion and indifference. You feel like you've walked into the waiting room of a restaurant that stopped serving centuries ago. Fact. For many Egyptians, especially those who couldn't afford an eternal endowment or whose family lines eventually vanished, offering simply stopped. Maybe not immediately. Maybe their children and grandchildren came faithfully, laying loaves and pouring beer, whispering names. But then came drought, war, debt, distraction. Eventually the tomb door stayed closed. The rituals faded, and the car was left hungry. You sit beside the table, trying to imagine the car of this tomb, still waiting, still hoping. There's no bitterness in the room, but there's a hollowness, a lightness that's not peace exactly, more like someone who fell asleep hungry and never woke up. There's a fringe theory among Egyptologists that some cave found ways to adapt, that even without offerings, even without names being spoken, they found nourishment in ambient memory, in being seen, in having their tomb visited by accident or intention. Some even believe that when modern archaeologists read a name aloud, or when a tour guide tells a tomb story, that counts, that the KA, long forgotten, receives that moment as a kind of spiritual snack. It's not much, but it's something. You wonder if your being here matters, if your footsteps and your attention are enough to jostle the silence. You look up at the faint inscription again, until memory ends. You think about what that really means. Memory doesn't just vanish all at once, it trickles out. A name spoken less often, a holiday skipped, a priest retired, a scroll misplaced. Eventually, there's just dust. There's ongoing debate about whether Egyptians feared this forgetfulness more than death itself. Some scholars say absolutely, they saw being forgotten as a second permanent death. Others argue it was accepted as part of the cycle, that everything fades eventually, even the most elaborate tombs. that the field of reeds wasn't about being remembered by the living, but being known by the gods. Still, the sheer volume of spells, statues, and carvings that beg for remembrance suggests that being forgotten was no small fear. You shift on the stone bench, dust clinging to your hands. Maybe this Ka wasn't powerful. Maybe he didn't have 100 loaves or 20 ducks or an entire ghostly workforce. Maybe he just hoped someone would show up now and then. And for a while someone probably did. You move slowly to the back wall, where the name of the tomb's owner is carved into a small panel, no bigger than a lunch tray. The hieroglyphs are worn but legible. Ankh-Hotep, son of Meru. Farmer, beloved of his mother. Gentle with oxen. It's simple, personal. There's no list of titles, no boasting, just a few facts. The kind of man you'd hope had friends. The kind of man you'd hope someone remembered. You trace the edge of the panel with your finger, not touching the name directly, just circling it. You whisper it aloud just once. Ankh-Hotep. It barely echoes, but it feels like it lands. Not dramatically, just softly, like a coin dropped into a deep well. There's a small basket of dried reeds in the corner, almost hidden behind the base of the wall. You pick it up gently. Inside there's an offering stick, half burned, a fragment of old linen, and a folded scrap of papyrus too brittle to open. Someone once left something here. Not long ago, maybe. Not recent either. Just not ancient. You think about what it means to be forgotten. Not by enemies, but by time. You think about how many tombs lie under desert sands, never found, their names never read, their food uneaten, their spirits uninvited. You think about how some ghosts aren't angry, just lonely. You whisper Ankh-Hotep's name again. Not because you expect a sign, but because someone should. Then you stand, brushing the dust from your hands, and turn toward the exit. And as you walk away, you don't hear a sound. But the silence behind you feels just a little more content. You leave Ankh-Hotep's quiet chamber with your thoughts stretched thin, like old papyrus. Worn, fragile, but still holding. The corridor ahead curves gently, leading you upward for the first time in what feels like hours. The walls here are plainer again, as if the tomb's energy has mellowed, and yet just ahead the glow of torchlight glints off something oddly colourful. You round the corner and pause. It's food again, not real food. This time it's unmistakably fake, but not in the sad, decaying way some offerings eventually become. These are fresh fakes, painted bread loaves, ceramic ducks, wooden beer jars, an entire meal sculpted, arranged, and displayed with theatrical perfection. It's a feast of illusion, and it's glorious. You've entered a chamber dedicated to substitutes, a kind of showroom of symbolic offerings, where food wasn't made to be eaten, but to be seen. You step closer to the painted bread, marvelled by how real it looks. The ridges of crust are perfectly etched, the colour mottled just right to mimic oven scorch. The jar beside it has a removable lid, and when you lift it, there's nothing inside, just air, dry and cold. It's an empty container pretending to be full, but somehow it doesn't feel like a cheat. It feels deliberate, designed. Fact. In later periods of ancient Egyptian history, particularly during the New Kingdom and into the late period, symbolic offerings became increasingly common. Tombs were often stocked not with actual loaves and ducks, but with painted images, carved replicas, and ceramic or wooden stand-ins. It was partly practical. Real food spoiled, attracted pests, and took up space, but it was also theological. By this point, many Egyptians believed the representation of an item, paired with the correct spell, could serve the Ka just as well as the item itself. You admire the craftsmanship of a wooden leg of beef, painted reddish-brown and glistening under the light. A linen-wrapped bundle nearby turns out to be a fake pomegranate, coated in red pigment, carefully speckled, even split at the top to reveal painted seeds inside. It's almost funny, like stage props for a play whose audience hasn't blinked in 3,000 years. And here's the quirky part. Sometimes these fake foods were accompanied by miniature inscriptions like bread for real or beer as though brewed, almost like labels at a museum exhibit. The Egyptians didn't try to fool the gods or the Ka, they just created a system where reality and representation blurred into usefulness. If it looked like bread and said it was bread, then with the right rituals it became bread. Not in the stomach maybe, but in the soul. You crouch beside a slab of painted stone that mimics a full platter, fish, cucumbers, onions, figs. It's flat, of course, but then shadows are drawn in with clever brushwork, and for a moment you forget that none of it is edible. The spell beside it is brief, just a few lines. May the suhrose, as the Nile gives life, may it never run dry. Simple, beautiful, efficient. Some scholars argue this shift towards symbolic offerings signals a decline in faith or resources, a cheapening of ritual, but others insist it was an evolution, faith adapting, becoming more portable, more scalable. When a tomb could be fed with words and wood instead of cattle and bakers, suddenly eternity was within reach for more people. It democratized the afterlife. It made immortality manageable. You notice a false door here too, more stylized than others you've seen, almost decorative. Around it are painted baskets filled with offerings, each item labelled like an ancient grocery aisle. There's no shelf, no table, no niche for real bread. Everything here is art, spell, simulation. But somehow the space feels just as sacred. Maybe more, because this is a room built entirely on faith, that the dead would be fed not by food but by form. And then you see something small tucked into the corner. A folded piece of cloth, yellowed with age but still holding its shape. You reach for it carefully and discover it's not cloth at all. It's painted linen stone, designed to look like folded fabric carved from a soft mineral and dyed to resemble aged linen. Even the napkin is fake. But in the world of offering substitutes, that still counts. Everything counts if it's given with care and paired with the proper spell. You sit for a while near the display, letting your eyes wander from one replica to the next. A jar that says milk, though it's filled with air. A dried bouquet of wooden leeks. A wax cake. You realise that in some ways this room is more honest than the others. It doesn't pretend the dead will actually bite into anything. It says, we remember what food looks like. We remember how it feels to give it. And sometimes memory is nourishment enough. There's a scholarly theory, less popular but compelling, that some fake offerings weren't meant for the car at all, but for the living. A way to rehearse generosity. To feel the gesture even when the goods weren't real. Maybe carving a duck in wood wasn't just about feeding the soul. Maybe it was a way for someone to say, I tried, I gave what I could. And maybe the car understood. You run your hand over the surface of the fake bread. It's cold and smooth, utterly inedible. And yet, it feels complete, like a promise kept. You whisper nothing this time, just stand, take one last look around, and step toward the exit. Because in this room, silence is the offering. The air feels stale again as you move forward, deeper into the tomb's skeletal veins. You've passed feasts both real and replicated, spells more alive than the flesh they were meant to feed, and offerings both tender and bureaucratically tracked. But now the tone shifts once more, and you feel it before you see it, the way you know a room has been violated even when everything is still. A kind of wrongness baked into the dust. The corridor narrows into a chamber where something is missing. Not forgotten, but taken. This is where the tomb robbers came. The first thing you notice is the disarray. Broken pottery scattered across the floor. Dried splinters of shattered wooden trays. A loaf carved from limestone that's been split clean in two. There's a wine jar with a smashed neck lying in a pool of its own dried pigment, like it bled paint instead of wine. A statue of a servant has been decapitated, its head nowhere in sight. The offering table is overturned, its legs snapped like matchsticks, and all along the wall you see the faint traces of fingernails scraping at plaster, like someone desperate or careless or both. Fact, tomb robbery in ancient Egypt wasn't just an occasional act, it was a thriving if unofficial profession. Even during the height of dynastic power, tombs were violated, emptied, and ransacked for everything from gold to linen to, yes, even food. Some tomb robbers were caught and punished brutally, beaten, mutilated, executed. Others probably bribed their way out, or were never caught at all. The irony, some were priests, the very people meant to protect the dead ended up looting them. You stand among the wreckage and imagine what it must have been like. A group of men slipping in under the cover of night, chisels in hand. Not looking for statues or scrolls, but for beer jars, bread loaves, anything sealed or wrapped or stored. The value wasn't just in gold, grain was currency and offerings were resources. A well-stocked tomb was like a pantry for the desperate. The quirky truth is that some of these looters didn't just take, they replaced. There are cases where tombs were broken into and afterwards someone, maybe the robbers, maybe another visitor, left behind small cheap offerings, a single loaf, a clay jar of water, a token, as if to say, I stole your dinner, but here's a snack. Guilt, superstition, a last-minute attempt to dodge a curse, no one knows for sure. You crouch beside a basket that's been crushed flat. It's still tied with linen cords, though most are frayed or snapped. Inside are the dusty remains of fruit, dates or figs, it's hard to tell. You imagine someone cracking it open in the dark, scooping out the contents, then discarding the shell like it meant nothing. But it did mean something. To the car who waited, to the family who left it, to the ritual it was part of. It meant everything. There's a scholarly debate about how tomb robbing was perceived in society. On the surface it was taboo, punishable by law, cursed in texts, condemned in temple inscriptions, but underneath it may have been more accepted, even systemic. During periods of political instability, entire tomb complexes were raided openly. Some pharaohs ordered their ancestors' mummies reburied in secret caches to protect them from theft. In other words, the system itself knew it was broken. You turn to the wall where a large painted scene has been mostly defaced. The banquet table is only half there, the geese have been scratched out, the breadbasket is smeared beyond recognition. You think of Ankh-Hotep's quiet room from earlier, so forgotten it became peaceful. But here someone remembered, and took. This car wasn't forgotten, he was robbed, and the difference is brutal. You wonder what happened next. Did the Ka rage? Did it wither? Did it adapt, trying to draw energy from scraps and shadows? Or did it become something else entirely? Something vengeful, lean, prowling the edge of the necropolis for a loaf that never comes. You sit on a toppled block, letting the silence crawl around you like sand in wind. The room isn't haunted exactly, but it feels charged. Like a space still trying to balance the books, still waiting for someone to undo what's been done. There's an offering stela in the back corner, cracked, dirt-streaked, but still intact. The inscription is short and aggressive, almost like a warning. May no thief feast, may no liar eat my bread. May their mouths dry and their limbs fail. No imagery, no food, just fury. You read it twice, then turn to go, and as you leave, you catch sight of something new in the dust, tiny footprints. Maybe a small animal wandered in, or maybe not. They wind between the broken jars and shattered trays, heading toward the back wall. And then, gone. No prints returning. You don't follow. Instead, you whisper something you don't even think about until the words are already in the air. Just a simple apology. Not because you robbed the tomb, but because someone did. And no one ever said sorry. You're quiet as you leave the looted chamber. Your footsteps measured, deliberate, like you don't want to wake the dust. The memory of the broken offerings lingers, heavy as wet linen. You keep thinking of that scratched-out goose and the smear where a basket used to be, like the painting itself was hungry and someone scraped the image right off the wall to eat it. But soon the air shifts again, lighter, less violated. You turn another corner and just like that you're somewhere new entirely. It's smaller here, intimate, cozy even. The walls are painted in warm ochre tones, and the light from your torch flickers across scenes that make you stop and squint. At first you think you're seeing another typical offering layout, but then you do a double take. Because that's not a human hand holding the bread, that's a paw. And that is very much a mummified cat, curled delicately beside an offering table, with its own miniature banquet waiting. Welcome to the other side of Egyptian eternity, the one reserved not for pharaohs or farmers or grumpy scribes, but for animals, pets, sacred creatures, and the occasional ibis who managed to rack up more prayers in death than most nobles did in life. Fact, Egyptians didn't just mummify humans, they mummified animals in the millions. Cats, dogs, baboons, falcons, snakes, crocodiles, bulls, beetles. If it walked, flew, slithered or scuttled, someone probably wrapped it in linen and gave it a tomb. Some were personal pets, buried with their owners, others were sacred animals connected to gods. The most famous of these, like the Apis bulls, got full-blown tombs, sarcophagi and regular offerings, including food. You crouch beside a low altar, where a carved relief shows a monkey holding what appears to be a piece of fruit in one hand and a jug of beer in the other. You laugh softly. It's unexpected, whimsical, but it doesn't feel like a joke. It feels serious. The monkey is seated like a king, with servants approaching, food offered, incense rising. Someone thought this creature deserved a seat at eternity's table. And here's the strange, wonderful fringe detail. Some mummified animals were found buried with actual food. Tiny trays of meat, grain, milk and fish, tailored to their diet. A mummified cat might be buried with dried mouse bones. A sacred ibis might get a bundle of frogs or insects. The idea was clear. These creatures didn't just die. They continued. They needed care, just like humans. You run your hand along the base of a painted scene showing a dog curled beside a fire, a loaf and a bowl of water beside him. The dog's eyes are expressive, even noble. You wonder if he belonged to someone. Was this tomb made just for him? Or was he buried beside a family who loved him, who wanted to make sure he was fed and warm even when his tail stopped wagging? There's a scholarly debate about how personal these animal burials were. Some clearly involved deep affection. A family cat mummified and placed beside its owner, with inscriptions that called it beloved or watchful companion. Others were part of mass production. Votive animals raised, killed and buried as offerings to the gods, not out of love but obligation. In those cases, the animals became part of a spiritual assembly line. Incense, sacrifice, interment, repeat. But here, in this chamber, you sense more tenderness than ritual. There's a display of small dishes, tiny bowls painted with patterns. One still holding a dried-out lump of something that might have been goat's milk cheese. Another is lined with the remains of dried grain. At the back of the room, a falcon's image is etched into the wall, wings spread, feathers drawn with stunning precision. A single offering jar stands below it, unbroken. Maybe no one ever disturbed this tomb. Maybe the falcon still watches, still waits. You sit on a carved ledge beneath a mural of a family gathered with their pets. Children hugging a pair of ducks, a woman feeding a gazelle from her palm, a monkey perched on the shoulder of a man pouring beer. It doesn't feel like mythology. It feels like memory. Like someone painted the best parts of their life to keep them close. And you think about what it means to feed a pet after death. Not just symbolically, but with care. With meat and grain and linen-wrapped treats. You think about your own animals, living or long gone, and wonder if any ancient part of you understands why this room makes you a little emotional. There's a single hieroglyphic line painted just above the dog mural, almost faded to invisibility. You lean in and trace it gently, reading the translation etched on the small plaque below. He comes when I call, even in silence. Let him be fed as I am fed. That one hits you harder than you expect, because here, finally, is a clue to something larger. That for the Egyptians, feeding the dead wasn't just theology. It was love. It was grief. It was hope with breadcrumbs. You stand slowly, offering a soft nod to the cat statue still guarding the corner, its eyes somehow sharper than they should be. Maybe it's watching, maybe it's just carved stone, but you don't test it either way. You leave the chamber without taking anything, not even a glance back, and make a mental note. If you ever do end up in the field of reeds, you'll save a little table in the shade. Enough room for a bowl of figs, a roast duck, and a nap spot for the cat. The corridor beyond the animal chamber narrows, as if the tomb is folding in on itself, wrapping tighter around your journey like a coil. The air changes again, drier, with an odd metallic bite, like sandstone licked by fire. It smells less like dust and more like incense that burned out a long time ago. Your torch flickers as you step into the next space, a chamber with darker walls, taller ceilings, and something different in the air. Not reverence, not sorrow, intrigue. This room doesn't feel like it was built by Egyptians alone. You pause beneath a painted arch, where the design breaks sharply from the rest of the tomb. You see lotuses, sure, but also ivy. You see hieroglyphs, and then, unexpectedly, Greek letters. The artwork here is different. The lines are looser, the colours bolder. The faces are more rounded, the clothes unfamiliar. You realise with a slow dawning chill that you've stepped into a hybrid zone, a cultural remix of traditions layered atop one another like time sediment. This is the part of Egypt where foreign hands fed the dead. Fact, Egypt wasn't always Egypt alone. Over its thousands of years it was conquered and ruled by Libyans, Nubians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans. And each brought their own beliefs, gods, and, critically, their own funeral customs. Some mixed these traditions with Egyptian ones, resulting in beautifully strange multicultural tombs. Egyptian soul parts, Greek-style portraits, Roman inscriptions offering bread to Osiris. You examine a large painted panel showing a familiar scene. An offering table piled high with bread, figs, ducks. But the man seated at the table isn't Egyptian in the traditional sense. His skin is lighter, his features more Romanized. He wears a toga, his hair is curled, and beside him, a golden ankh in one hand and a Greek inscription beneath his chair that still reads, "I feast in peace beyond the Nile, watched by Hermes and Osiris alike." You smile. That's one way to cover your bases. This cultural blending wasn't just cosmetic. It shaped how the dead were fed. Greek and Roman elites who lived in Egypt often adopted Egyptian burial customs, mummification, tomb offerings, afterlife beliefs, but adapted them. They painted their portraits on wood panels, attached them to the mummified body, and included both Greek prayers and Egyptian spells. It was spiritual dual citizenship, complete with double sets of gods and funeral foods. Here's the fringe detail. In some Greco-Egyptian tombs, archaeologists have found wine amphorae labelled in Greek but offered to Osiris. Cheese platters, yes, cheese, buried beside figs and flatbread. Even olive oil used in embalming rites. It wasn't just foreign families living in Egypt, it was Egypt learning to speak new culinary and religious dialects. You move to another part of the chamber, where a mural depicts Anubis alongside a Greek-style angel, both standing at an altar. The altar itself is painted in vivid colour. Bread loaves, a whole fish, a cluster of grapes, and a small pork joint. That last one makes you pause. Pork wasn't standard fare in traditional Egyptian offerings, often avoided in temple rituals, but here it's front and centre, a sign that funeral meals evolved with the people who prepared them, and it wasn't just Greeks and Romans bringing their foods. Nubians had their own burial practices too, including food offerings buried in tall ceramic jars, meals of millet, dates, and fish from the Nile. The gods may have been Egyptian, but the menu changed depending on who was at the table. Some scholars debate whether this mixing of cultures diluted Egyptian beliefs or enriched them. The purists argue that foreign influence weakened traditional funeral rites, made them less authentic. But others see it differently. Egypt didn't crumble under foreign customs, it adapted. Rewrote the menu, let Hermes dine beside Osiris, let Greek cheese be offered with Egyptian beer. It wasn't corruption, it was communion. You crouch beside a stone slab engraved with side-by-side offering lists. On the left, hieroglyphs listing bread, beer, fowl, incense. On the right, Greek letters spelling out artos, oinos, gala, bread, wine, milk. The symmetry is beautiful, each column facing inward like a conversation between worlds. You wonder if the key appreciated the variety, if it didn't matter who poured the beer, as long as someone did. In a niche near the rear wall you find a small wooden panel, what must have once been a painted funerary portrait. The face is still mostly visible, a young woman with wide eyes and a faint smile, painted in the Fayum style. She wears a golden necklace, a sheer veil over her hair. Beneath the portrait, faint traces of both scripts remain. Her name was Demetria. One line reads, "Fed in life, fed in peace." The other says, "May she eat at the table of the gods, all of them." You sit with that for a while, letting the silence fill in the spaces between languages. This chamber isn't confused, it's harmonious. Proof that food was the one universal gesture. That no matter who ruled or which gods were in favour, the core desire stayed the same. Feed the dead, remember the name, bridge the world between breath and dust. You rise slowly, tracing one last look at the painted figures breaking bread in both directions. East to west, Nile to sea, scribe to senator. And you realise the care, no matter what it was called, still wanted the same thing. A full plate, a kind word, a ritual that said, you still matter. And maybe in that the dead were never foreign to one another. They were just hungry. The chamber of cultural crossovers fades behind you, its portraits and painted amphorae lingering in your mind like ghostly postcards. You feel your way through a tight corridor again, one shoulder grazing cool stone. The walls close in with a purposeful hush, like the tomb is now pulling you inward, not just physically but emotionally, towards something more ancient, more primal. You've seen opulence and imitation, bureaucracy and betrayal, sacred cats and divine ducks. But this next chamber, this one feels different, more sacred. Not in the ceremonial sense, but in the gut-deep gooseflesh on your neck way that says, something happened here that mattered. You step into the chamber slowly, and the air changes instantly. Cooler, yes, but also far denser, as though it's been waiting to be disturbed. Your torchlight reveals a single raised platform at the centre of the room, surrounded by a square groove in the stone. It's not a banquet table, it's not a statue base, it's an altar. And everything about it says this was the beginning of everything. The room is simple, undecorated, even austere, but your skin tightens as if invisible eyes are watching. This, you realise, is where the first offerings were made. Before the spells, before the painted loaves, before the pyramids or priests or papyrus contracts. This was the impulse, the moment the living first asked, what if they're hungry? Fact, in Egypt's pre-dynastic period, before unified kingdoms, before the gods had family trees, burials were simple pits in the desert sand. Bodies laid in fetal positions, wrapped in mats, surrounded by the barest essentials, a pot of beer, a piece of bread, maybe a dried fish or a hunk of meat. No false doors, no elaborate finery texts, just instinct, care. A kind of quiet terror that death might not be the end, and that whoever lay in that shallow grave might wake up cold, alone, and starving. You crouch beside a smooth stone bowl embedded in the platform. It's charred black inside. The residue of burned offerings, animal fat, incense, no one knows for sure. But someone made fire here. Someone stood in this very spot and gave something up, and maybe food, maybe something less tangible. Maybe a prayer, maybe a name, the fringe detail. Some of the oldest burials in Egypt contain no hieroglyphs, no symbols at all, but show signs of repeated visitation. Footprints preserved in dried mud, layers of ash from small fires, renewed again and again, suggest that even before organised religion, the dead were fed. Not out of dogma, but out of longing. Maybe guilt, maybe hope. You sit on the edge of the platform and run your hand along a series of small notches carved into the floor. They're crude, uneven. You count them, 9 on one side, 7 on the other. Not decorative, not symmetrical. Functional, markers of ritual, counting the days since burial. Theories abound, but the truth is no one knows. These people left no written record. Only the gesture remains. Give something, leave something, don't forget. Some scholars argue that this primitive form of offering wasn't religious at all, but practical. In a society that valued reciprocity, maybe the living left food for the dead to ensure they wouldn't be haunted, cursed, or forgotten. A transaction. You feed them so they don't harm you. But others argue, and maybe you agree, that it's more emotional than that. Even now we leave flowers at graves, favourite snacks, tokens, not because we believe the dead consume them, but because we need to offer. Grief needs motion, memory needs expression. You lean back and stare at the ceiling, which is low and smoke-stained. This wasn't made for art. It was made for ritual. You can almost hear the faint murmur of a small group gathered here thousands of years ago, faces lit by fire, hands shaking as they placed food beside someone they loved. No priest, no spell, just an act that said, "You meant something, you still do." There's a small pottery shard tucked near the altar's edge, probably part of a bowl once used to hold offerings. It's etched with a pattern of lines, deliberate but undecipherable. You imagine a woman sitting cross-legged, scratching that pattern with a bone tool the way you might doodle when you don't know what else to say. Maybe it was her father's grave, or her brother's, or a lover she wasn't allowed to name aloud. And maybe that act of carving lines into clay was the first offering spell. You think back to all the ornate tombs you've passed through, the lists, the menus, the models. All of it builds on this, on the fire-blackened bowl and the quiet grief of early humans trying to figure out how to love someone even after their body stopped answering. This was the origin, the sacred dinner before the sacred texts. Some archaeologists refer to this as the emergent ritual phase, but that feels too clinical, too stiff. You don't feel theory in this room, you feel feeling. The raw, aching tenderness of the first human to look at a corpse and think, I hope you're not hungry where you're going. You rise slowly, brushing dust from your palms, and take one last look at the platform. It's not much, but it doesn't need to be. This is the seed. Everything else, every duck, every spell, every painted banquet, is a blooming of this original gesture. Feed the dead, not because the gods demand it, not because the priests ordered it, because someone once mattered, and still does. The silence you carry from the ancient altar isn't heavy, it's grounding, like dust that settles instead of suffocates. The further you walk, the more that silence becomes your companion, not your burden. The corridor begins to widen now, and slowly, like the tomb is preparing you for something. A soft draft brushes against your arm. Is that fresh air? Not quite, but it's movement, a signal that you're nearing the final loop of this long, looping journey through death's banquet hall. You step through one last threshold into a space both stark and stunning. This isn't a tomb chamber in the traditional sense. It's a gallery of names. Thousands of them carved into walls, written on fragments of wood, scratched onto broken pottery shards. A dizzying collage of remembrance. Most are in hieroglyphs, arranged in neat columns. Others are crude and sideways, scratched in haste. A few are written in Greek or Coptic. Some are repeated over and over. One name, Cheneferu, is inscribed 42 times in one corner, each instance slightly different, like someone returned again and again, carving his memory deeper into time. This is the name room. You didn't know it existed. Most people don't. It's not meant for tourists, not even priests really. It's a space where memory outlives the people who made it. A room where offering is reduced to its purest form, not food, not ritual, but identity. Because if the Egyptians feared anything more than hunger in the afterlife, it was erasure. Fact, in ancient Egyptian belief, the soul wasn't just one thing. It was made up of several parts, including the Kher, the bear, the Ren, and the Ak. Of these, the Ren, the name, was perhaps the most vulnerable. As long as your name was spoken, remembered, written, your soul had a thread to the world of the living. But once your name disappeared, that was the second death, the permanent one. You kneel by a cracked stone slab where a name is just barely legible. The glyphs for Ipu have been scratched almost to nothing. You can still make out the reed leaf, the quail chick, the single outstretched arm. It's faint, fading, but still there. And suddenly it makes sense why the dead wanted to be fed. Food sustains the care, sure, but the offering is also a performance of memory. To feed someone is to say, I know who you are. And that may be the more nourishing than duck stew. A quirk of the name cult system? Names could survive long after the body vanished. Archaeologists have found tomb fragments with only a name. No bones, no sarcophagus, no shrine. Just a name carved in limestone or written in red ochre. Someone's way of keeping a promise, someone saying, you were here, you mattered. One such fragment is here on the far wall, just a single line. He who ate beside me, though I forget his face. The name following it is mostly chipped away, but someone once tried. Someone offered what they had left. You step carefully around a cluster of offering bowls placed beneath a long shelf of name shards. Some bowls are new, off-white pottery, unglazed, untouched by time. Others are cracked, darkened with soot. People still come here, you realise. Modern visitors, descendants, historians, pilgrims of memory, it doesn't matter. They come with bread, beer, dried fruit, or sometimes just a name scribbled on paper. One bowl contains a note, its ink faded but still legible. You lean closer and read, for Neferhotep, who wrote the bread lists. I say your name, it's unsigned, and yet it feels more personal than anything you've seen so far. Neferhotep may not have had a grand tomb or a golden sarcophagus, but someone remembered him for what he did, keeping track of who got fed. There's ongoing scholarly debate about how seriously this name magic was taken. Was the spoken name literally fuel for the soul, or was it more symbolic, a poetic metaphor for continued connection? The academic arguments are many, but here in this room, surrounded by layers of name after name, it doesn't feel metaphorical at all. It feels like the thing that matters most. Because what's food, really? Without someone saying, this is for you. What's a duck or a loaf of bread if there's no name to attach it to? No recipient? You can't feed anonymity. You can only feed someone. You walk along the southern wall where a newer section holds names etched in childlike scrawl. They aren't carved deeply, just scratched with something sharp and uncertain. Maybe a visiting student. Maybe a child brought to the tomb by a devout parent. You spot one inscription that reads, My mother, Tia. I miss her bread. That one sticks in your chest. And isn't that what it's all been about? Bread. The eternal metaphor, the physical and the spiritual, kneaded together and offered to whatever part of the dead might still be listening. You take a seat on a bench carved from the wall itself. Your torch flickers low now, its flame shivering with exhaustion. In the quiet, you hear the faintest sound, a drip of water from somewhere behind the stone, a beetle clicking along a crevice, and maybe, just maybe, the whisper of a name someone else is saying in another chamber. You speak one too. Doesn't matter whose. Maybe someone you love, maybe a name from the wall. You say it softly, like feeding it into the dark. Neferhotep. And just like that, for one more day, he is not forgotten. You don't leave the name room right away. You linger, letting the last echo of the name you just spoke settle in the stones, unsure if you're comforting the dead or yourself. Maybe both. Eventually your torch dips even lower, the flame curling inward like a flower closing for the night. So you rise quietly and follow a narrow corridor that seems to slope upward. The air grows cooler but fresher too, like it's been filtering in from somewhere closer to the surface. You've reached the end, or at least the edge of this long, hollowed-out journey. The final chamber isn't dramatic. There are no gold walls or sacred statues, just a rectangular space with a domed ceiling decorated in stars. You tilt your head back, and they shimmer faintly in the torchlight, faded but still there. A cosmic ceiling for a tomb built under the weight of eternity. You're not alone in here. Several stone benches line the walls. An old altar stands at the centre, worn smooth by centuries of touch, and on it, a loaf of real bread. That's what stops you. It's not ceramic or painted or etched in hieroglyphs. It's a plain barley loaf, dried almost into stone but unmistakably real. You walk toward it slowly and notice a folded scrap of papyrus beside it, ink barely legible. You squint to read. For all the names no one remembers. That's it. No signature, no prayer. Just an offering made to the forgotten, to the ones whose voices stopped carrying. This is the final truth the Egyptians understood so deeply. Not everyone would be remembered, not every name carved, not every duck painted, not every soul spoken of long after death. Most would fade, offerings would stop, tombs would collapse, but even then, someone might still place a loaf of bread on a stone and say, "This is for you." Fact. In Egypt's later periods, especially under Greek and Roman influence, communal offerings became more common. Priests began leaving general offerings not just for named ancestors, but for the blessed dead, the nameless, those whose scrolls are lost. Whole tombs were built to serve as shared resting places for people without family or fortune. Even in bureaucracy there was kindness. You sit on one of the benches, watching your flickering torch throw shadows across the ceiling stars. It's quiet, but not dead. The room hums with soft presence. This is where all the offerings, real and imagined, end up. The food, the names, the grief, the guilt, the hope. You realise now that feeding the dead wasn't about nutrition. It was about continuity, keeping something moving across the great stillness. Here's the fringe fact that almost no one talks about. Even today, people still bring food to these tombs. Not tourists. Locals. Families, sometimes archaeologists, quietly, discreetly, a fig, a crust of bread, a jar of water. Not to test ancient theology, just because something ancient in us still understands. That death doesn't mean silence, that a gift can travel across time, that a soul long vanished might still listen when we say, "Here, I remembered." You think back over everything you've seen. The painted feasts, the real banquets, the fake ducks, the legal contracts, the ghost complaints, the mummified cats and ceremonial cheeseboards. It should be overwhelming, but instead it all flows into something simple. We are all, in the end, remembered by what we gave and what was given to us. You run your hand gently across the stone altar. It's cool, dusty, and steady, like the idea of eternity made tangible. And then, with no ceremony, no recitation, you whisper something quiet and personal into the stillness. Maybe a name, maybe a thank you, maybe nothing at all, just breath. As you rise to leave, you glance once more at the lone loaf on the altar. It's not extravagant, it's not eternal, but it's still here, and that means someone was fed.